welcome to Legacy of Throne. Before we begin this extraordinary journey through the most devastating conflict in human history, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on the bell notification so you never miss our next story. On this channel, we uncover the rise of empires, untold battles, hidden turning points, and the secrets that shaped the world as we know it. Subscribe now because history belongs to those who choose to remember it. The guns of World War I had finally fallen silent. Millions were dead. The world made a solemn promise, never again. But from the ashes of that peace, something darker began to grow. A storm was building, and almost no one could see how terrible it would become. New leaders rose, angry, loud, and extraordinarily dangerous. They promised to make their country great again, no matter the cost. They blamed outsiders, scapegoated minorities, and weaponized national humiliation into political power. And one by one, the world ignored the warnings. In 1939, the world broke again, but this time, the war would go farther, last longer, and kill more people than anyone thought possible. This is the complete story of World War II, how it started, how it spread, and how it changed the world forever. You have heard about this war, but not like this. World War I ended in November 1918. It had been called the war to end all wars, a conflict so devastating, so unprecedented in its industrial slaughter, that the civilized world convinced itself that humanity would never permit such a catastrophe again. But it didn't end with justice or healing. It ended with silence, pain, and a broken world whose wounds were deep enough to fester for a generation. Across Europe, the scale of destruction was almost impossible to comprehend. Approximately 17 million people had died, soldiers and civilians alike. Cities and villages across France, Belgium, Russia, Serbia, and the Ottoman Empire lay in ruins. Entire families had been wiped out. An entire generation of young men, the most vigorous, the most educated, the most promising, had been fed into the industrial killing machine of the Western Front and not returned. The demographic impact would be felt for decades in every country that had participated. People desperately hoped that the peace would finally bring relief. But the peace that followed did not heal anything. It only deepened the wound, in ways that would prove catastrophic. In 1919, the leaders of the victorious powers Britain, France, the United States, and Italy gathered at the Palace of Versailles near Paris to determine the shape of the post-war world. Their intentions were complex and sometimes contradictory. American President Woodrow Wilson had arrived with his 14 points, an idealistic program for a new world order built on self-determination, open diplomacy, and collective security through a League of Nations. But Wilson's idealism collided with the French desire for security and revenge, the British desire for imperial consolidation, and the Italian demand for territorial compensation. What emerged was a compromise that satisfied nobody fully and humiliated Germany profoundly. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination that had started the war, imposed terms on Germany that its leaders found deeply shocking and unjust. Germany was required to accept sole responsibility for causing the war, the infamous War Guilt Clause of Article 231. Germany was stripped of approximately 13% of its territory, including the coal-rich Saarland placed under League of Nations administration. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France, and the Polish corridor carved from West Prussia to give the newly independent Poland access to the Baltic Sea. Germany's overseas colonies were distributed among the Allied powers. The German army was limited to 100,000 men, a fraction of the force that had recently fought across 2 continents. The navy was reduced to a handful of ships. The air force was abolished entirely. Submarines were prohibited. Most crushing of all was the reparations burden. Germany was required to pay 132 billion gold marks, approximately $33 billion at 1919 exchange rates, to compensate for the damage caused by the war. For a country whose economy was already strained by 4 years of total war mobilization, this figure was staggering. The payments would consume enormous portions of Germany's national income for decades. The German public was stunned. Many had not fully understood how badly the war was going in its final months. The domestic censorship and propaganda of the Kaiserreich had painted a picture of impending victory right up until the armistice. The sudden surrender, combined with the shocking terms of the treaty, CR, eated a powerful narrative of betrayal. Who had stabbed Germany in the back? The politicians who had surrendered, the socialists, the liberals, the Jews, anyone but the military that had actually lost the war. This stab in the back myth, Dolchstoß legend in German, was historically false but politically potent, and it would fuel the rise of extremist movements for the next 15 years. Germany sank into economic disaster of almost incomprehensible severity. The political instability of the new Weimar Republic, Germany's first democratic government, born from the ashes of the Kaiser's abdication and immediately saddled with the shame of Versailles, created conditions in which normal economic management was nearly impossible. By 1923, Germany was experiencing hyperinflation of a kind that had no real precedent in modern economic history. The German mark, which had traded at approximately 4.2 to the dollar before the war, was trading at 4.2 trillion to the dollar by November 1923. People literally carried wheelbarrows of banknotes to buy basic groceries. The life savings of the German middle class, the cautious, respectable, hard-working people who had put their money in banks and bonds, were wiped out in months. Children played with stacks of useless currency. Families who had worked for generations to build modest prosperity found themselves destitute overnight. The psychological impact of this economic catastrophe was profound and long-lasting. Trust in democratic institutions, already fragile, collapsed further. People who had been financially secure felt humiliated, frightened, and angry. They looked for explanations that made sense of their suffering, and they were vulnerable to narratives that assigned blame clearly and promised decisive action. While Germany was struggling, the broader landscape of Europe and the world was also changing in alarming directions. In Italy, the outcome of the war had created its own sense of grievance. Italy had entered the war on the Allied side in 1915, lured by promises of territorial gains. When the peace settlement delivered less than those promises, the mutilated victory, as Italian nationalists called it, the resulting rage and disappointment created fertile ground for extremism. A young, charismatic, and utterly ruthless former socialist newspaper editor named Benito Mussolini saw his opportunity. He formed the Fasci di Combattimento, the Fasces, the symbol of bundled sticks that gave fascism its name, in 1919, recruiting veterans, nationalists, and adventurers into a movement that promised national greatness through violence and authoritarian discipline. His black-shirted squadristi beat, intimidated, and murdered political opponents. They burned socialist newspapers and union halls. They terrorized the countryside and the cities alike. By October 1922, Mussolini had orchestrated the March on Rome, a political bluff that frightened the Italian establishment into handing him power, making him prime minister at the age of 39. Within a few years he had turned Italy into a fascist dictatorship, the first in Europe, a model that would inspire imitators across the continent. In Russia, the chaos of the revolution and civil war that had followed Russia's collapse in 1917 had produced the Soviet Union, a communist state of breathtaking theoretical ambition and terrifying practical brutality. The ideological founder Vladimir Lenin had died in 1924, and after a brutal succession struggle, Joseph Stalin emerged as the dominant figure. Stalin was not a theorist or a visionary, but an organizer, national genius of boundless ruthlessness. He collectivized Soviet agriculture, forcing peasants onto collective farms against their will, and the resulting disruption, combined with deliberate policy choices, caused a famine that killed millions, particularly in Ukraine, in 1932 and 1933. He conducted the Great Terror of 1936 to 1938, a purge of real and imagined enemies that consumed millions of victims. Shot in the basements of NKVD prisons, sent to the labor camps of the Gulag, or simply removed from their positions and their families without explanation. He elevated himself to a cult figure of almost religious dimensions, the father of peoples, the genius without whose guidance the Soviet Union would be lost, while conducting a regime of systematic fear that touched every Soviet citizen. In Japan, the trajectory was different in its specifics, but similar in its direction. Japan had been modernizing rapidly since the Meiji Restoration of 1868, building a military and industrial capacity that had already surprised the world by defeating China in 1895 and Russia in 1905. Japan had fought alongside the Allies in World War I and had been rewarded with German colonial territories in the Pacific and a seat at the Paris Peace Conference. But Japanese nationalists felt that their country was not receiving the respect it deserved from the Western powers. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and the subsequent London Naval Treaty imposed limits on Japanese naval construction that Japanese military leaders resented bitterly. Economic depression hit Japan severely in the early 1930s. The military, which had substantial independent political power under the Meiji Constitution, began to dominate government. In 1931, the Kwantung Army, the Japanese garrison in Manchuria, staged the Mukden incident, a manufactured provocation that they used as a pretext to seize the entire Manchurian region of northern China. The League of Nations condemned the seizure. Japan simply resigned from the League and kept Manchuria. Back in Germany, the economic and political crisis of the early 1930s delivered the opportunity that Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist German Workers' Party had been waiting for since the failed beer hall putsch of 1923. Hitler was an Austrian-born World War I veteran of modest but genuine combat experience who had developed a worldview compounded from Angerman nationalism, virulent antisemitism, social Darwinism, and a ruthless understanding of how to manipulate mass psychology. His book, Mein Kampf, written while he was serving a comfortable prison sentence for the failed putsch, laid out his program with remarkable candor. Destroy the Versailles settlement, rebuild German military power, expand German territory eastward into what he called Lebensraum, living space, and remove Jews from German society. Remarkably, few people took the book seriously when it was published. They should have. The Great Depression that began with the American stock market crash of October 1929 DND, spread globally through 1930 and 1931, was the crisis that delivered Hitler to power. German unemployment, which had been recovering from the hyperinflation crisis, shot back up to approximately 6 million, roughly a third of the labor force. Banks failed. Businesses collapsed. The Weimar Republic's coalition governments proved unable to manage the crisis. The political parties of the center and moderate left were discredited by their inability to deliver results. The extremes, Nazis on the right, communists on the left, grew rapidly as desperate people abandoned democratic parties for those that promised decisive action. By 1932, the Nazi Party was the largest single party in the German Reichstag, though it had not won a majority. In January 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg, the octogenarian Field Marshal Paul, who had commanded Germany's armies in World War I, appointed Hitler as Chancellor. The establishment conservatives who advised Hindenburg believed they could use Hitler channel his political support for their own purposes while keeping him under control. They were catastrophically wrong. Within months, Hitler had used the Reichstag fire blamed on a Dutch communist, almost certainly a Nazi provocation to pass the enabling act that gave him dictatorial power. Other political parties were banned, trade unions were abolished, the press was controlled. Political opponents were sent to the first concentration camps, established at Dachau, near Munich in March 1933. Germany was now a dictatorship, and Hitler called it the Third Reich, the Third Empire of German history. The persecution of Jews began immediately and escalated steadily. The April 1933 boycott of Jewish businesses was followed by the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, which expelled Jewish civil servants from their positions. The Nuremberg Laws of September 1935 stripped Jews of German citizenship and prohibited marriage or sexual relations between Jews and Aryans. Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, on November 9, 1938, saw coordinated pogrom attacks across Germany and Austria. Approximately 7,500 Jewish businesses destroyed, 1,400 synagogues burned, 91 Jews killed outright, and approximately 30,000 Jewish men sent to concentration camps. The world expressed horror. No government acted. Hitler simultaneously began rebuilding German military power in open defiance of Versailles. Military conscription was reintroduced in 1935. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, prohibited since 1919, was publicly revealed. In March 1936, German troops reoccupied the demilitarized Rhineland, a move that Hitler himself later described as the most nerve-wracking of his career, since he had ordered his generals to retreat if France moved against them. France did not move. The military action that might have stopped Hitler at essentially no cost was not taken. The Rome-Berlin axis was formalized in October 1936, linking Mussolini's Italy with Hitler's Germany in an ideological partnership. Japan joined the Anti-Comintern Pact in November 1936, creating the framework that would become the Axis alliance. The major powers of aggressive nationalism and fascism were linking arms. The Spanish Civil War, which erupted in July 1936, when General Francisco Franco and other nationalist officers launched a military uprising against the elected Republican government, became the conflict in which Germany and Italy tested their military equipment and tactics against a real opponent. The German Condor Legion, the Italian CT-5, Corporal Volunteer Force, and various other Axis military units gained invaluable combat experience and demonstrated new weapons and tactics. The bombing of Guernica on April 26, 1937, carried out by the German Condor Legion and Italian Aviazione Legionaria, destroying a Basque market town and killing hundreds of civilians, horrified the world and inspired one of the greatest paintings of the 20th century. Pablo Picasso's Guernica captured the chaos and agony of the bombing in stark black and white, and it became a permanent monument to the civilian costs of modern warfare. The democratic, aka Britain, France, and the United States observed the war with concern but maintained a policy of non-intervention that effectively ensured Franco's eventual victory. The world was spiraling. The First World War had left countries weak, bitter, and broken. As the dust of one war settled, the storm of another began to form. But this new catastrophe would not come from armies alone, it would come from ideas, big, dangerous, seductive ideas that took hold of nations and transformed ordinary politicians into dictators who wielded the power of life and death over millions. In Germany, Hitler's rise to absolute power was completed with extraordinary speed. Between January 1933 and August 1934, barely 18 months, he transformed Germany from a democratic republic, however fragile, into a personal dictatorship with no institutional checks on his authority. The Enabling Act of March 1933 gave him the power to pass laws without the Reichstag. The Night of the Long Knives in June 1934, in which Hitler ordered the murder of Ernst Rehm, the leader of the SA, stormtroopers, and dozens of other potential rivals, demonstrated that he would use lethal force against his own movement to consolidate power. When President Hindenburg died in August 1934, Hitler merged the offices of President and Chancellor, making himself Führer and Reich Chancellor. Every soldier in the German military now swore a personal oath of loyalty to Hitler himself, not to Germany, not to the Constitution, but to the man. Hitler's political genius, if it can be called that, was his understanding of mass psychology. He had spent years studying propaganda, learning from the Allied methods he had observed in the First World War, absorbing the ideas of Gustav Le Bon on crowd psychology, and developing his own instincts for what people wanted to hear and how they wanted to hear it. His speeches were not arguments, they were emotional experiences. The Nuremberg rallies, staged with extraordinary theatrical precision by the architect Albert Speer, were designed to overwhelm individuals with the collective power of the nation. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered in darkness, illuminated by the beams of searchlights pointing to the heavens, organized in perfect geometric formations, their individual identities dissolved into the mass. The effect was deliberately quasi-religious, the creation of a sense of sacred national community, Volksgemeinschaft, that offered belonging and purpose to people whose lives had been shattered by economic catastrophe and political humiliation. He gave people someone to blame. The Treaty of Versailles, the November criminals who had supposedly betrayed Germany in 1918, the international Jewish conspiracy that he alleged was responsible for Germany's suffering. These narratives were false, but they were emotionally satisfying and psychologically powerful. They converted complex, structural problems, the economic consequences of the war, the failures of the Weimar political system, the global depression, into simple stories with identifiable villains, and once the villains were identified, the solution was obvious: remove them. In Italy, Mussolini had demonstrated the fascist model nearly a decade before Hitler came to power. The Deuce, leader, ruled through a combination of theatrical bravado, actual violence, and the systematic dismantling of democratic institutions. He eliminated the free press, banned opposition parties, dissolved the elected parliament, and replaced it with a corporatist chamber of fasces and corporations, brought the Catholic, licensed church into an accommodation through the Lateran Accords of 1929, and launched a series of foreign adventures designed to satisfy nationalist ambitions. The invasion of Ethiopia in October 1935, conducted with poison gas against an essentially defenseless African kingdom, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Ethiopian soldiers and civilians, was condemned by the League of Nations, with economic sanctions that were deliberately designed to be too limited to work. The message was clear: Mussolini could break international law without serious consequences. In the Soviet Union, Stalin was constructing a different kind of totalitarian state, communist in ideology, but increasingly resembling the fascist states in its practical mechanisms of control. The Great Purge of 1936 to 1938 was perhaps the most spectacular act of political self-destruction in the history of any modern government. Stalin systematically eliminated virtually the entire leadership of the Soviet military, the Communist Party, and the state bureaucracy. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky and most of the senior Red Army commanders were arrested, tortured into confessions of espionage and sabotage, and shot. 3 of the 5 Soviet marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, 50 of 57 corps commanders, and approximately 35,000 of 70,000 officers at all levels were purged. The Soviet military would enter the Second World War commanded almost entirely by officers who had been promoted to positions far beyond their experience and training. often terrified to report bad news upward for fear of arrest. The Great Purge extended far beyond the military. Old Bolsheviks, who had made the revolution with Lenin, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, Rykov, were put on show trials, forced through elaborate choreographed confessions of impossible crimes, and executed. Writers, scientists, engineers, economists, and educators were arrested in vast sweeping operations. Approximately 750,000 to 1.2 million people were shot during the Great Terror. Another 1.3 million were sent to the Gulag labor camps. The terror created a society in which virtually every person lived in constant fear of denunciation, where children informed on parents, where every conversation might be reported, where any connection to someone who had been arrested could be enough to trigger your own arrest. Yet Stalin also built things. The first and second five-year plans of 1928 to 1937 turned the Soviet Union from a largely agrarian society into a significant industrial power, though at extraordinary human cost. New cities appeared in Siberia. Steel mills, coal mines, and power stations were constructed at breakneck speed. The Soviet industrial capacity relocated east of the Ural Mountains and therefore out of reach of German forces would eventually prove crucial to Soviet survival. But the Soviet Union that entered the Second World War was simultaneously a formidable industrial giant and a traumatized society led by terrified commanders who had been taught that independent judgment was dangerous. In Japan, the trajectory toward war was driven by a military establishment that had achieved near total dominance over the civilian government. The assassination of prime ministers and other moderate politicians by right-wing military officers in the early 1930s demonstrated that the Ba constitutional framework was essentially meaningless. Anyone who proposed accommodation with the Western powers or restraint in China risked their life. The ideology driving Japanese expansion was a mixture of imperial nationalism centered on reverence for the Emperor Hirohito as a divine figure, social Darwinist convictions about Japanese racial superiority, genuine anxiety about Japanese economic vulnerability. Japan lacked the natural resources oil, rubber, iron ore that a modern industrial economy required, and a military culture that valued offensive action and national honor above calculated strategic prudence. The full-scale invasion of China that began in July 1937 with the Marco Polo Bridge incident near Beijing revealed both the power and the moral bankruptcy of Japanese militarism. The rape of Nanjing, the six-week orgy of murder, rape, looting, and arson that followed the Japanese army's capture of the Chinese capital in December 1937, killed between 80,000 and 300,000 civilians and prisoners of war by most historical estimates. The Japanese soldiers who participated were not anomalies, they were the product of a military pettika training system that had deliberately dehumanized the enemy and removed inhibitions against violence. The world was shocked. No government with the power to act did anything meaningful. Three things united all these dictatorships: fascist, Nazi, and militarist across the continent. Ideological differences. First, total control. One-party states with no meaningful opposition, no free press, no independent judiciary, and no limits on executive power. Second, violent nationalism. The absolute priority of national, or racial, or imperial identity over individual rights, the glorification of military power, and the willingness to use violence domestically and internationally to achieve national goals. Third, expansionist ambition. The conviction that their nation was destined for greatness, that existing international arrangements were unjust constraints on that destiny, and that force was a legitimate and even ennobling tool for achieving national objectives. Democracy was on the defensive. In Britain and France, the political classes were paralyzed by the trauma of the First World War, the instability of the Depression, and a genuine moral revulsion at the prospect of another conflict. In the United States, isolationism was politically dominant. The Neutrality Acts of the mid-1930s restricted American ability to support countries under attack. In country after country, the democratic response to the dictator's provocations was retreat, accommodation, and hop. I hope that the aggression would stop, that the next demand would be the last, that war could be avoided if only enough were conceded. It could not. The dictators were rising. Their armies were marching. Their speeches were filled with fire and threat, and the world was watching. But watching is not stopping, and the distinction between the two would cost millions of lives. Germany had torn up the Treaty of Versailles clause by clause. Hitler rebuilt his army in open defiance of the treaty. He sent troops into the demilitarized Rhineland in March 1936, betting that France would not respond. He was right. He formed the Rome-Berlin Axis and the Anti-Comintern Pact with Japan, building the coalition that would become the Axis powers. Mussolini had crushed Ethiopia with poison gas. Japan had invaded China and committed atrocities that shocked even hardened observers. Stalin was murdering his own people by the hundreds of thousands. All of this happened while the world said no effective word. The policy of appeasement attempting to maintain peace by satisfying the demands of aggressive powers, giving them what they wanted in hopes that satiated, they would stop, was not born from stupidity or cowardice, though it was sometimes accompanied by both. It was born primarily from fear, the genuine, visceral, entirely understandable fear of another world war on the part of people who had lived through the first one. In Britain, where the losses of World War I had been catastrophic and where the memory of the trenches was still raw, the popular and political opposition to another continental war was overwhelming. Stanley Baldwin, Neville Chamberlain, and the conservative establishment were not ignoble men. They were men who desperately wanted to spare their country from the horror they had witnessed or heard about in 1914 to 1918. Their failure was not of character, but of judgment. The inability to recognize that this Hitler was not a rational statesman who could be satisfied, but an ideologically driven revolutionary who would stop only when stopped. The appeasement policy also reflected a genuine ambiguity about Germany's grievances. Many British observers, including some who were alarmed by Hitler, believed that Germany had legitimate complaints about the Versailles settlement, that the territorial changes imposed on Germany had been too harsh, and that a negotiation, revision of some of those provisions might actually produce a stable European order. This was not an unreasonable view in the abstract. Its fatal flaw was the assumption that Hitler wanted a revised Versailles settlement rather than the destruction of the entire post-1919 European order. The Spanish Civil War provided the first major test of whether the democracies would confront fascist aggression, and they failed it comprehensively. The non-intervention agreement of August 1936, signed by 27 European nations, including Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union, was immediately and openly violated by Germany and Italy, who continued to provide military assistance to Franco throughout the war. Britain and France, determined to avoid any action that might escalate the conflict into a general European war, stuck to the agreement even as evidence of Axis violations poured in. The practical effect was that the Republic, which was receiving some Soviet assistance, fought against nationalist forces backed by two major European powers while the democracies stood aside. The bombing of Guernica on April 26, 1937, demonstrated what modern air power could do to civilian populations. It demonstrated it with horrible clarity. The German Condor Legion and Italian forces dropped approximately 50 tons of bombs and incendiary devices on the Basque market town over approximately 3 hours. Buildings collapsed, fires spread. People fleeing the initial bombing were strafed by fighter planes. The death toll is disputed, ranging from 150 to 1,600 in various estimates, but the psychological impact was enormous. The world saw that the next war would not be confined to the battlefield, that air power had made every city a potential target. The reaction was widespread horror, but no change in policy. The annexation of Austria in March 1938, the Anschluss came through a combination of Nazi pressure, internal Austrian Nazi agitation, and the threat of military force. Hitler drove his car across the border from Germany to his birthplace of Braunau am Inn to Tar. Carefully orchestrated demonstration of pan-German popular sentiment. British and French protests were limited and quickly dropped. The League of Nations took no action. Austria, an independent nation of 7 million people, was absorbed into the Third Reich in a single day. The Sudetenland crisis of summer 1938 brought Europe to what appeared to be the brink of war. The Sudetenland, the heavily German-speaking border regions of Czechoslovakia, had been included in the new Czech state in 1919 over German objections, and a significant minority of the German-speaking population, though by no means all of it, had grievances about treatment under Czech rule. Hitler, using the Sudeten German Party, led by Konrad Henlein, as his instrument, orchestrated a crisis that escalated through the summer, demanding that the Sudetenland be transferred to Germany and making increasingly extreme claims of Czech persecution of the German minority. The Munich Conference of September 29th to 30th, 1938, involving Britain's Neville Chamberlain, France's Édouard Daladier, Hitler, and Mussolini, but deliberately excluding Czechoslovakia itself, produced the infamous agreement that ceded the Sudetenland to Germany without Czech consent. Chamberlain returned to London, waving the paper he had signed with Hitler, proclaiming peace for our time to cheering crowds who were genuinely relieved that war had apparently been averted. The Czechs were not consulted about the dismemberment of their country. In 6 months, in March 1939, German troops occupied the rump Czech state of Bohemia and Moravia entirely, violating every undertaking Hitler had given at Munich. Slovakia was established as a nominally independent Nazi satellite. Czechoslovakia ceased to exist. The policy of appeasement had demonstrably failed. Hitler had shown that he was not interested in a revised Versailles settlement, he was interested in conquest. Britain and France, finally recognizing the reality they had been avoiding, issued guarantees to Poland and Romania. If Germany attacked these countries, Britain and France would go to war. The guarantees were meant as a deterrent. They were not accompanied by any serious military preparation that might make them credible. Hitler, meanwhile, executed the most audacious diplomatic stroke of the pre-war period. On August 23, 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression agreement between two states whose ideologies were supposedly diametrically opposed and whose leaders regarded each other with genuine contempt. The world was astonished, but the pact included secret protocols that divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Poland would be divided between them, with the Soviet Union also receiving Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and part of Romania. On September 1, 1939, at 4:45 a.m., German forces crossed the Polish border. The Second World War had begun. The invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, was the moment that transformed a European political crisis into a world war. But what it unleashed in those first terrible days changed the nature of warfare itself, demonstrating a form of military operation that the world had never seen at such scale or with such devastating effectiveness. The German military strategy against Poland Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, combined three elements in a devastating synergy that Polish forces, however bravely they fought, had no adequate means of countering. First, overwhelming air superiority. The Luftwaffe's approximately 1,600 bombers and 1,100 fighters targeted Polish airfields, communications centers, rail junctions, and military command posts in the opening hours, destroying a significant portion of the Polish Air Force before it could get airborne and disrupting the command infrastructure that coordinated Polish defense. Second, fast-moving NG armored forces. 6 panzer divisions and 4 light divisions of motorized infantry advanced at speeds that operational doctrine of the previous era had simply not anticipated. Rather than engaging in the extended positional battles of World War I, the German armored units punched through the defensive line at multiple points and then raced forward, bypassing strongly held positions, cutting supply lines, and creating the kind of confusion and demoralization that made coherent defense impossible. Third, close coordination between ground and air. Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, ungainly, terrifying aircraft with fixed undercarriage and ear-splitting sirens designed specifically to maximize psychological impact, acted as mobile artillery for the advancing ground forces, striking targets that could not be reached by conventional artillery. The Polish military was not, as sometimes portrayed, simply incompetent. Poland's army of approximately 950,000 men was not negligible, and it fought with considerable determination and courage in a number of engagements. The famous charge of Polish cavalry against German tanks is largely a myth. Polish cavalry were primarily used as mobile infantry rather than as mounted shock troops, and the specific incidents that gave rise to the legend involved reconnaissance units who were caught in the open by German armor after an initial success, not suicidal charges by saber-wielding hussars. The real problems were structural: inadequate armored forces of its own, an air force that was qualitatively and quantitatively outmatched, a strategic situation that exposed nearly the entire perimeter of Poland to attack, German-controlled East Prussia threatened from the north, Germany from the west, German-controlled Slovakia from the south, and then catastrophically, the Soviet invasion from the east. The Soviet invasion of September 17, 1939, conducted under the pretext of protecting the Ukrainian and Belarusian minorities in eastern Poland, was arguably the decisive blow. The Polish government had been attempting to organize a final defensive position in the southeastern corner of the country, hoping to maintain resistance until a French and British offensive in the west forced Germany to redeploy forces from Poland. The Soviet attack from the east eliminated that possibility. Poland was caught between two totalitarian powers, and had no means of resistance. Warsaw endured a siege from September 8 to September 28, 1939, subjected to massive artillery bombardment and air attack that killed tens of thousands of civilians and reduced significant portions of the city to rubble. The civilian population of Warsaw, who had no part in the military decisions that had brought this catastrophe to their city, lived through weeks of constant bombardment, food and water shortages, and the growing realization that no relief was coming. On September 27, the Warsaw garrison surrendered. On September 28, the German and Soviet foreign ministers, Ribbentrop and Molotov, signed a treaty dividing Poland between their two countries. Britain and France had declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939, honoring their guarantees to Poland. But there was nothing they could do to help Poland in the immediate term. Britain had sent the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, to France, where it deployed along the Belgian border. French forces were positioned behind the Maginot Line, but there was no immediate offensive against Germany. The period that followed became known as the Phony War, or Sitzkrieg, Sitting War, a strategic interlude of several months, during which both sides in the West were technically at war but conducting almost no active military operations. The Nazi occupation of Poland that followed the military victory was brutal beyond measure. Separate administrations were established for the different zones. Some territory was directly annexed to the Reich, some was established as the general government under the brutal administration of Hans Frank. Within weeks, organized persecution of the Polish intelligentsia, clergy, and Jewish population began. The Einsatzgruppen mobile killing units that would later carry out mass murders throughout the Soviet Union began their work in Poland in 1939. Jewish communities were immediately subjected to persecution, humiliation, forced labor, and the beginnings of the process that would ultimately lead to systematic extermination. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, having secured its portion of Poland, moved to consolidate its position in Eastern Europe. Finland was invaded in November 1939, the Winter War, in which the Finns' heroic resistance against enormously superior Soviet forces exposed the terrible consequences of Stalin's purge of the Red Army. Officer Corps. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were occupied in 1940. Eastern Romania was seized in the same year. The Soviet Union was pursuing its own form of imperial expansion with methods hardly distinguishable from Germany's. The Katyn massacre, in which approximately 22,000 Polish military officers, policemen, intellectuals, and other members of the Polish elite was systematically murdered by the Soviet NKVD on Pekai VD on Pekai. Stalin's direct orders in spring 1940 was one of the most significant war crimes of the early conflict, though its attribution to the Soviets, rather than the Germans, to whom it was falsely attributed by the Soviet Union for decades, would not be officially acknowledged until 1990. After the invasion of Poland, the world waited. For 7 months from October 1939 to April 1940, the Western Front was Dor, characterized by what soldiers called the phony war and German propagandists called Sitzkrieg. British and French forces deployed, dug positions, and waited for a German attack. German forces trained, reorganized, and planned. Minor skirmishes occurred. Patrol activity was sporadic, but the expected cataclysm did not come. Then, beginning on April 9, 1940, Germany began its offensive in the west with the invasion of Denmark and Norway. Denmark was occupied within hours, virtually without resistance. Norway proved more difficult, and the British and French mounted a counter-expedition that achieved some local successes, but ultimately failed to prevent German control of the strategically crucial country. The Norwegian campaign had an important political consequence in Britain. It contributed to the loss of confidence in Neville Chamberlain's government and his replacement on May 10, 1940, by Winston Churchill. The same day that Churchill became Prime Minister, May 10, 1940, Germany launched its main offensive against France and the Low Countries. The German plan, the Manstein Plan, named after its primary architect Erich von Manstein, though officially developed by the OKH, was a stroke of operational genius that exploited Allied assumptions about German intentions. The Allies expected the main German effort to come through Belgium, a repetition of the Schlieffen Plan of 1914, and had deployed their strongest forces, including the British Expeditionary Force and France's best mobile units, to advance into Belgium and meet the expected thrust. The Germans duly invaded Belgium and the Netherlands, drawing these Allied forces forward. The real German effort, however, came through the Ardennes, the densely forested, hilly terrain of southern Belgium and Luxembourg that military doctrine had consistently identified as unsuitable for large armored forces. General Ewald von Klest's Panzer Group, including some of Germany's most capable armored divisions, and commanded at the operational level by the brilliant and aggressive General Heinz Guderian, moved through the Ardennes with 7 armored divisions and 3 motorized infantry divisions in a column so long that its tail was still in Germany when its head was approaching the Meuse River. French and Belgian intelligence detected the movement but grossly underestimated its scale and speed. On May 13th, German forces crossed the Meuse at Sedan and Dinant. The French Second Army at Sedan crumbled under combined air and ground attack in Tass, what became one of the most rapidly decisive engagements in modern military history. The breakthrough was achieved. Guderian, against orders that repeatedly tried to slow him down, raced his armor westward toward the English Channel with an operational pace that left the Allied command structure completely unable to respond coherently. By May 20th, just 10 days after the offensive began, German armor had reached the English Channel at Abbeville, cutting off all Allied forces in Belgium from France. The trap was shut. The encircled Allied forces, approximately 330,000 British, French, and Belgian troops, were compressed into a shrinking perimeter around the port of Dunkirk. The German army closed in from the south and east. German armor had all but reached Dunkirk when, on May 24th, a halt order was issued, one of the most controversial decisions of the entire war. Historians still debate its causes. Hitler's personal intervention, concerns about the boggy Flanders terrain unsuitable for tanks, deference to Goering's argument that the Luftwaffe could destroy the trapped forces, or perhaps a political calculation about leaving a path open for a negotiated settlement with Britain. Whatever the reason, the halt order gave the Allies 3 days to organize their defenses. The evacuation of Dunkirk, Operation Dynamo, conducted from May 26 to June 4, became one of the defining stories of the war, though its emotional and political significance has sometimes overshadowed the military reality that it was, at its core, a massive defeat. The Royal Navy, supplemented by hundreds of civilian vessels, pleasure boats, fishing trawlers, ferries, and Thames riverboats, whose owners had answered emergency government calls, evacuated 338,226 Allied soldiers from the beaches. The miracle of Dunkirk genuinely was a remarkable organizational and human achievement. The improvised civilian fleet, the courage of the soldiers on the beaches who maintained order under constant air attack, the skill of the naval crews who crossed and recrossed the Channel. Churchill used the evacuation to craft a narrative of defiant resistance that would sustain British morale through the dark months that followed. "We shall fight on the beaches," he told the Commons on June 4. "We shall never surrender." But the soldiers came back without most of their equipment. The BEF left behind approximately 2,500 guns, 64,000 vehicles, 20,000 motorcycles, and 76,000 tons of ammunition on the beaches of Dunkirk. The British Army would spend years rebuilding the equipment that was abandoned in those terrible days. France fell, all with a speed that stunned the entire world. Paris was declared an open city on June 10. The French government fled, first to Tours, then to Bordeaux. The French army, still enormous in number and not entirely without capability, was nevertheless unable to form a coherent defensive line. The government of Paul Reynaud fell and was replaced by the 84-year-old Marshal Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun, who had been convinced for months that France's cause was hopeless and who sought an armistice. On June 22, 1940, France signed an armistice in the same railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne where Germany had signed Breda. The armistice ending World War I, a deliberate humiliation that Hitler savored with visible satisfaction. France was divided. The northern and western portions, including Paris and the Atlantic coast, under direct German occupation, the southern portion governed by the new French state under Pétain, based at the spa town of Vichy. Vichy France was not an occupied zone, it had a degree of formal sovereignty, but it collaborated actively with the German occupiers, including in the deportation of Jews. In 6 weeks, one of the world's major powers had been defected. It was the most rapid and complete collapse of a great power in European military history, and it transformed the strategic situation entirely. Britain now stood alone against the Nazi-dominated continent. France had fallen. Most of Europe was now under Nazi control or Nazi influence. Hitler's armies stretched from the North Atlantic to the borders of the Soviet Union. Only one major power remained standing in Western Europe: Britain, separated from German-controlled territory by the 21 miles of the English Channel, led by a new Prime Minister whose entire career had been a preparation for exactly this kind of crisis. Winston Churchill had been a controversial and frequently wrong politician throughout the 1930s. His warnings about Hitler had made him enemies rather than friends in an establishment committed to appeasement. But now, with appeasement's catastrophic failure undeniable, Churchill's consistent anti-Nazi stance was vindicated, and his extraordinary personal qualities, the physical courage, the rhetorical genius, the iron determination, the ability to communicate a sense of purpose and defiance that could sustain a nation through apparently hopeless circumstances, were exactly what the moment required. His speeches in the summer and autumn of 1940 are among the greatest in the English language, and they functioned as genuine strategic instruments, not merely rhetoric. They told the British people what kind of war this was, what was at stake, and what was required. Hitler was genuinely uncertain about what to do with Britain after France's fall. He had long expressed admiration for the British Empire, considering it a model of Germanic racial achievement, and he hoped that Britain would make peace, accepting German continental dominance in exchange for the security of its global empire. He made several peace overtures, through neutral intermediaries and in public speeches, that were contemptuously rejected by Churchill's government. As it became clear that Britain would not negotiate, Hitler turned to planning invasion. Operation Sea Lion, the planned German amphibious invasion of Britain, faced enormous practical difficulties. The German army and navy had no experience with large-scale amphibious operations. The German navy, Kriegsmarine, was far smaller than the Royal Navy and had suffered significant losses in the Norwegian campaign. The invasion barges assembled in French and Belgian ports were slow, unseaworthy, and vulnerable to British naval attack. Any German invasion force crossing the Channel would have been enormously vulnerable to Royal Portery Navy attack unless Germany achieved air superiority over the crossing zone and the landing beaches. The prerequisite for Sea Lion was the destruction or neutralization of the Royal Air Force. The Battle of Britain, the sustained German air campaign against Britain from July to October 1940, can be divided into several distinct phases. In July and early August, the Luftwaffe focused on attacking British shipping in the Fokker Channel and coastal convoys, testing British radar and fighter response. In August, the campaign intensified against RAF fighter command itself, attacking airfields, radar stations, aircraft factories, and sector control stations. This phase, from August 13th, Adlotag or Eagle Day, to September 6th, came closest to success. The RAF was losing pilots and aircraft faster than they could be replaced. Sector stations that coordinated the fighter response were repeatedly attacked. The pressure was unsustainable. Then Hitler made the decision that changed the battle's outcome. Following a small British bombing raid on Berlin, conducted in retaliation for an accidental German bombing of London, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to shift its primary effort to bombing London and other British cities. The first major bombing of London on September 7, 1940, marked the beginning of the Blitz. It was a strategic error of the first importance. By abandoning the attacks on fighter command's infrastructure, the Luftwaffe allowed the RAF to recover, repair damaged airfields, and maintain the command and control systems that were essential to effective interception. The RAF had several crucial advantages, ages that partially offset its numerical inferiority. It was fighting over home territory, which meant that British pilots who survived being shot down could parachute to safety and fly again the next day, while German pilots who survived going down over Britain became prisoners. Britain's radar network, the Chain Home System, supplemented by the Observer Corps, provided early warning of incoming German formations that allowed fighter command to vector its limited resources to where they were needed, rather than maintaining expensive standing patrols. The RAF's sector control system, which communicated raid information to individual fighter squadrons in real time, allowed an efficient and coordinated defensive response. And Britain's aircraft production, managed with impressive effectiveness by the Minister of Aircraft Production Lord Beaverbrook, actually exceeded Germany's during the critical months of the battle, a fact that is often overlooked in narratives focused on pilot losses. The young men who flew for fighter command during the Battle of Britain came from throughout the British Empire and from the occupied nations of Europe: British, Australian, New Zealand, Canadian, South, the African, Rhodesian, Polish, Czech, Belgian, and French pilots flew under RAF command. The Poles in particular, flying with the ferocity of men whose country had been conquered and whose families were under occupation, proved themselves exceptional combat pilots. Number 303 Squadron, a Polish unit, achieved the highest kill ratio of any fighter command unit during the battle. The statistics of the battle are stark. Fighter command lost approximately 544 pilots killed and 422 seriously wounded between July and October 1940. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 1,733 aircraft compared to approximately 915 RAF fighters destroyed. It was Churchill's everlasting tribute to these pilots: "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few," that captured the moral weight of what they had done. The Blitz continued. London was bombed for 57 consecutive nights from September 7, 1940 onward, and the bombing of British cities continued with varying intensity until May 1941. More than 43,000 British civilians were killed in the Blitz, and hundreds of thousands were made homeless. The industrial cities of Coventry, Liverpool, Birmingham, Plymouth, Southampton, and others south UFA devastating raids. Coventry Cathedral, bombed on November 14, 1940, became one of the most powerful symbols of the war's destruction, its ruined shell preserved after the war as a memorial. But British civilian morale, while severely tested, did not collapse in the way that pre-war air power theorists had predicted. The spirit of the Blitz, the stubborn, often darkly humorous refusal to be broken, became one of the defining narratives of the war. By mid-October, it was clear that the Luftwaffe had failed to destroy fighter command or to establish the air superiority that Operation Sea Lion required. On October 12, Hitler officially postponed Sea Lion until spring 1941, a postponement that became permanent as German strategic attention shifted east. The Battle of Britain was not just a military victory. It was a political and psychological turning point. Hitler had been stopped. The record of unbroken Axis victories, Poland, Denmark, Norway, France, the Low Countries, Belgium, had been interrupted. Somewhere in the world, the aggression had been met and turned back, and from the damaged airfields and burned streets of Britain, the long road back toward German defeat had its beginning. While armies clashed across continents and plains screamed above burning cities, another kind of war was being fought in silence. It had no uniforms or flags. It followed no front lines and recognized no rules. It was fought in alleyways, in forests, in cellars lit by single candles. It was fought with coded messages, forged documents, and the quiet, extraordinary courage of ordinary people who refused to accept the reality that the Nazi occupation was attempting to make permanent. After Germany conquered most of Western Europe in 1940, resistance was initially sporadic, disorganized, and almost entirely local. In the first shock of defeat, most people were simply trying to survive, to understand what had happened, to find food, to locate separated family members, to navigate the complex new realities of occupation. But beneath the surface of accommodation and apparent normality, a different reality was growing. In France, the first acts of resistance were almost symbolic. Painting the Cross of Lorraine, the symbol of de Gaulle's Free French movement, on walls, distributing clandestine newspapers that printed news uncensored by the German occupiers, helping British men who had been shot down to evade capture. The réseau, network, structure of French resistance, organized into cells that knew as little as possible about other cells, to limit the damage any single arrest could cause, gradually developed into a sophisticated organization capable of gathering intelligence, conducting sabotage, and maintaining communication with London through clandestine radio operators. In Poland, the situation was different. Poland had never accepted its occupation as France had, and the Polish underground state, perhaps the most extensive resistance organization of the entire war, operated schools. The Nazis had closed Polish educational institutions, published underground newspapers, ran a clandestine judicial system, organized a military underground, the Armia Krajowa, or Home Army, and conducted intelligence operations of crucial importance to the Allies. Polish intelligence's early penetration of the Enigma cipher machine and their provision of reconstructed machines to French and British intelligence in 1939 was one of the most significant intelligence contributions of the entire war. The intelligence services that linked resistance networks in the occupied, countries to the Allied governments in London were themselves remarkable organizations. Britain's Special Operations Executive, SOE, established in July 1940 on Churchill's instruction to set Europe ablaze, trained agents for insertion into occupied Europe by parachute or small boat. The agents are a mix of British nationals, European immigré volunteers, and men and women from occupied countries who had escaped to Britain, carried forged identity documents, civilian clothing, and radio transmitters whose signals they had to keep brief to avoid direction finding by the German security services' triangulation equipment. The female agents of the SOE deserve particular recognition. Women were less likely to be subjected to routine security checks in occupied France. Men of military age were always potentially subject to being questioned about why they were not in labor service, and several women became extraordinarily effective resistance organizers. Virginia Hall, an American who worked first for the SOE and later for the OSS, the American Office of Strategic Services, forerunner of the C-First Affairs, for Vers Gestapo, having her description and offering ARDs for her capture. She organized resistance networks, trained agents, facilitated supply drops, and helped hundreds of people escape through Spain. The Gestapo called her the most dangerous Allied spy in France. She conducted much of her work while living with a prosthetic leg. She had lost her day in a hunting accident in 1933, which made her an even more remarkable figure. Noor Inayat Khan, born in Moscow to an Indian father and an American mother, raised in France and England, a trained musician and children's author, became the first female wireless operator inserted into occupied France by the SOE. She worked in Paris from June 1943, operating under constant danger as German direction finders hunted her transmissions. Her cell was penetrated almost immediately, but she refused the order to return to Britain, aware that she was the only remaining communication link between Paris networks and London. She was eventually betrayed and arrested in October 1943, and after repeated escape attempts, she was executed at Dachau concentration camp in September 1944. She was posthumously awarded the George Cross, Britain's highest civilian gallantry award. The most consequential intelligence operation of the war was conducted not in occupied territory, but in a Victorian country house in Buckinghamshire called Bletchley Park. The Government Code and Cipher School, assembled there from the outbreak of the war, employed an extraordinary collection of mathematicians, chess players, crossword puzzle enthusiasts, linguists, and other unconventional thinkers tasked with breaking German military communications. The German military used the Enigma cipher machine, an electromechanical device of considerable complexity, whose settings changed daily to encrypt all significant communications. The mathematical foundation for breaking Enigma had been laid by Polish mathematicians Marian Rogajski, Jerzy Rosiecki, and Henryk Zygalski, who had been working on the problem since 1932 and whose work, transferred to Britain in 1939, provided the crucial starting point for British code-breaking. At Bletchley, the mathematician and logician Alan Turing developed the bomb, an electromechanical device that could rapidly test possible Enigma settings against known or guessed plaintext that made large-scale Enigma decryption feasible. The intelligence product, codenamed Ultra, as so sensitive that elaborate measures were taken to conceal from the Germans that their communications were being read. When Ultra intelligence revealed the location of a specific convoy or the schedule of a specific military operation, it had to be acted upon in ways that provided an alternative explanation for Allied foreknowledge. A reconnaissance aircraft would be sent over the relevant area so that if the Germans investigated why their operation had been anticipated, they would find evidence of conventional reconnaissance rather than code-breaking. The secret was maintained throughout the war, and for 30 years afterward, Ultra contribution to the Allied war effort was incalculable. In the Battle of the Atlantic, it allowed convoys to be routed around U-boat patrol lines. In the North African campaign, it gave British commanders detailed knowledge of Rommel's supply situation and operational plans. In the lead-up to D-Day, it confirmed that German forces had accepted the Allied deception operation and believed the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. Churchill called it "my most secret source." Post-war historians have argued that Ultra shortened the E was by 2 to 4 years. As Europe burned and resistance fighters worked in shadows and cellars, a different kind of war erupted far from the cities and forests of the continent. This one was fought not in trenches or cobblestone streets, but in sand, the endless, blinding, brutal sand of the Sahara and the coastal plains of Libya and Egypt. It was a war of extraordinary tactical complexity, of supply lines stretched to breaking point across thousands of miles of waterless wilderness, of commanders whose genius for improvisation and operational surprise elevated desert warfare into a form of art. And at its center was one of the most remarkable military rivalries of the entire war. Italy's colonial ambitions in North Africa predated the war. Libya, conquered from the Ottoman Empire in 1911 to 1912, was an Italian possession, and Mussolini dreamed of expanding Italian control to Egypt, then under British protection, and potentially beyond. The Italian 10th Army in Libya, commanded by Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, launched its long-delayed invasion of Egypt in September 1940, advancing hesitantly about 60 miles before stopping at Sidi Barrani to build fortified camps and await the supplies. The advance demonstrated both Italy's ambitions and its limitations. The Italian military, for all its size, suffered from poor equipment, inadequate motorization, indifferent senior leadership, and a serious morale problem rooted in the soldiers' general awareness that Mussolini's war was not their war. The British counterattack Operation Compass, launched in December 1940 under General Richard O'Connor, was one of the most brilliantly executed campaigns of the entire war. What began as a planned 5-day raid against Italian positions expanded into a full-blown offensive as the Italian forces collapsed. In 2 months, the Western Desert Force, later the 8th Army, destroyed 10 Italian divisions, advanced 800 kilometers, and captured approximately 130,000 prisoners, 400 tanks, and 1,290 guns, at a cost of fewer than 2,000 British and Commonwealth casualties. It was an astonishing military achievement, and demonstrated what an inferior but well-commanded force could accomplish against a larger but poorly led enemy. The disaster Mussolini faced in Libya required German intervention, and Hitler dispatched the Afrika Korps 2 armored divisions under the command of Lieutenant General Erwin Rommel to Libya in February 1941. Rommel's arrival transformed the campaign. He was perhaps the most purely gifted tactical commander of the entire war. Aggressive almost to the point of recklessness, superbly attuned to the opportunities and demands of mobile armored warfare, personally brave to a degree that was simultaneously inspiring and dangerous, and possessed of an operational imagination that repeatedly caught his opponents off balance. He arrived in Libya before his forces were fully assembled and immediately launched offensive operations, catching the British in the middle of a planned withdrawal and achieving a rapid advance that drove them back to the Egyptian border within 2 months. The next 2 years of the North African campaign were characterized by a dramatic back-and-forth quality, the Benghazi handicap, as British soldiers sardonically called it, in which first one side, then the other, achieved breakthroughs that could not be exploited fully because of supply constraints. Rommel repeatedly attacked when his supply situation was desperate, gambling that a rapid advance would capture British supply dumps that could sustain further operation. Rations. He was repeatedly right until he wasn't. The critical battle came at El Alamein in October and November 1942. General Bernard Montgomery, meticulous, publicity-conscious, occasionally insufferable, but genuinely capable, had taken command of the 8th Army in August 1942 and had spent the subsequent weeks rebuilding its morale, reorganizing its logistics, and refusing to be hurried into premature offensive action. He understood that to beat Rommel, he needed overwhelming superiority in men and material, and he waited until he had it. The Second Battle of El Alamein, which opened with a massive artillery bombardment on the night of October 23, 1942, involved 195,000 British Commonwealth troops and 1,029 tanks against approximately 104,000 Axis troops and 547 tanks. The battle was brutal. Unlike some previous engagements, it did not produce the rapid breakthroughs that armored warfare enthusiasts hoped for, but instead became a grinding attritional struggle in which the 8th Army's superior numbers and supply situation gradually overwhelmed the Afrika Korps. By November 4th, Rommel's forces were in retreat. He had asked Hitler for permission to withdraw. Hitler had refused, and ordered his men to stand fast or die. Rommel disobeyed, saving what remained of his army. On November 8, 1942, just 4 days after El Alamein, a massive Anglo-American force landed in Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch. This was the first large-scale American combat operation in the European theater, involving approximately 107,000 troops under the overall command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The French forces in North Africa, loyal to the Vichy regime, offered limited and inconsistent resistance before reaching agreements with the Allied commanders. The Torch landings opened a second front in North Africa that put Rommel and the Afrika Korps in an impossible strategic position. Squeezed between the 8th Army, advancing from the east, and the Allied First Army from the west, the American forces had a difficult learning curve. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943, inexperienced American units were badly handled by Rommel in one of his last offensive strokes of the campaign. The lessons learned at Kasserine about training, leadership, combined arms coordination, and logistics were absorbed with remarkable speed by the American military, which reorganized, and improved its performance substantially in the weeks that followed. By May 1943, approximately 275,000 Axis troops, German and Italian, surrendered in Tunisia. The total North African campaign was over. It had lasted nearly 3 years, consumed enormous resources on both sides, and produced some of the most dramatic operational maneuvers of the entire war. But its strategic significance was clear. The Allies had their first major land victory against the German army. They had secured the entire southern shore of the Mediterranean, and they had a launching pad for the invasion of southern Europe. The war in North Africa had shown the world that the Axis could be stopped. But while tanks clashed under the North African sun, something far greater and far darker was building in the east. Back in Europe, Hitler had set his eyes on the prize he had always considered the ultimate goal of his ideological vision, the Soviet Union, the vast Eurasian heartland that he intended to conquer, colonize, and depopulate to provide living space for the German master race. Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, was the largest land invasion in the history of warfare. The numbers, Ni, were staggering. Approximately 3.8 million German and Axis troops, including Romanian, Hungarian, Italian, Finnish, and other Allied forces, attacked across a front of approximately 1,800 kilometers, supported by approximately 3,600 tanks, 2,700 aircraft, and 600,000 motorized vehicles. Against them stood approximately 2.9 million Soviet troops deployed in the western military districts, supported by approximately 15,000 tanks, most in poor mechanical condition, and 8,000 aircraft. The strategic planning for Barbarossa combined extraordinary operational ambition with ideological fanaticism and logistical naivety in proportions that would ultimately prove fatal. The German Army High Command, OKH, had never seriously grappled with the reality of conducting sustained offensive operations in a country of Soviet geographic scale. The supply infrastructure of the Third Reich was fundamentally inadequate for the task. The railway gauge in the Soviet Union was wider than the German standard, requiring time-consuming conversion or the use of captured Soviet rolling stock. The road network in Western Russia was sparse, and the few major roads that existed dissolved into impassable mud during the autumn rains and spring thaw. Hitler confidently told his generals that "We only have to kick in the rotten door and the whole rotten structure will come crumbling down." It was one of the most catastrophically wrong assessments in military history. The opening phase of Barbarossa was genuinely catastrophic for Soviet forces. The Luftwaffe destroyed approximately 1,200 Soviet aircraft on the first day of the attack, many of them on the ground at airfields that had been carefully identified by months of reconnaissance overflights. German ground forces, exploiting the tactical shock of the surprise attack, achieved breakthroughs within hours along multiple axes and began the deep encirclements that would characterize the early months of the campaign. The Battle of Bialystok-Minsk in late June and early July trapped and destroyed approximately 340,000 Soviet troops in the largest encirclement of the war's first weeks. The Battle of Smolensk in July to August trapped approximately 310,000. The Battle of Kiev in September was the largest encirclement in the history of warfare, resulting in the capture of approximately 665,000 Soviet soldiers. The statistics of Soviet losses in the EFA first 6 months of Barbarossa are almost incomprehensible. By December 1941, the Soviet Union had lost approximately 4.5 million soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. The pre-war Standing Red Army had been virtually destroyed. The Soviet Air Force had been reduced to a fraction of its pre-war strength. Most of the European Soviet Union's industrial base, which was located west of the Korn Bay, Ural Mountains, and therefore in the path of the German advance, had been captured, destroyed, or only partially evacuated. And yet, the Soviet Union had not collapsed. This was the fundamental failure of German strategic planning, the assumption that the destruction of the Red Army's pre-war forces would cause the Soviet state to disintegrate. It did not disintegrate. Several factors explain why. First, The sheer geographic scale of the Soviet Union meant that German forces, for all their operational achievements, were advancing into a vastness that swallowed their victories without producing strategic decision. Second, Soviet industrial capacity mobilized with desperate urgency and partially relocated east of the Urals in a feat of organizational heroism during the autumn and winter of 1941 continued to produce weapons and equipment even as the western regions were overrun. Third, Stalin, however catastrophically he had degraded Soviet military capacity through his purges, displayed personal and political resolve in the crisis, remaining in Moscow, making clear that there would be no repeat of 1917, and organizing the defense of the capital with the same ruthless energy he brought to everything. The German drive on Moscow. Operation Typhoon began on September 30, 1941, and initially achieved spectacular results. The Battle of Bryansk and Vyazma in October trapped another 673,000 Soviet troops and seemed to open the road to Moscow. The Soviet government evacuated many ministries and diplomatic missions to Kuibyshev, now Samara, though Stalin himself refused to leave. But the autumn rains turned the Russian roads into quagmires, the famous Rasputitsa, the season of bad roads, and the German advance slowed dramatically. When temperatures dropped to unprecedented lows in November and December 1941, the German army, which had been assured the war would be over before winter and had not been equipped with adequate cold weather gear, began to experience the consequences of having planned for a 3-month campaign. German soldiers fighting in temperatures below -40 degrees Celsius found that weapons jammed, vehicles refused to start, and frostbite claimed more casualties than enemy action. The contrast with the Soviet forces, equipped with padded jackets, felt boots, and white camouflage, was devastating. And from Siberia, where divisions had been maintained against the possibility of a Japanese attack, Stalin began transferring well-trained, winter-equipped troops to the Moscow front. On December 5, 1941, one day before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the Soviet counterattack before Moscow began. German forces were pushed back from the outskirts of the city, and the myth of German invincibility was broken. The invasion of the Soviet Union was not just a military campaign, it was a war of ideology and extermination from its very beginning. The Commissar order issued before Barbarossa required the summary execution of all captured Soviet political commissars. The orders for the conduct of operations in the Soviet Union explicitly suspended the laws of war and the Geneva Conventions. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units of the SS and Seku, RITI police, followed the advancing German forces and conducted mass murders of Jews, Communist Party officials, and other designated enemies. These operations would ultimately kill approximately 1.5 million people in the Soviet Union and the Baltic states, and they represented the beginning of the systematic genocide that would reach its full industrial scale with the death camps established from late 1941 onward. The Eastern Front was the defining theater of the Second World War in its scale, its brutality, its strategic consequences, and its human cost. It dwarfed every other campaign of the conflict. Approximately 80% of all German military casualties in the entire war were suffered on the Eastern Front. Approximately 27 million Soviet citizens, soldiers, and civilians died in what the Russians call the Great Patriotic War. Two city names above all others came to embody the war's dimensions of suffering, courage, and historical consequence: Leningrad and Stalingrad. Leningrad, formerly and subsequently St. Petersburg, the city that Peter the Great had built as Russia's window to the West, and that had been Lenin's revolutionary capital, was surrounded by German and Finnish forces in September 1941 and remained besieged for 872 days until January 1944. Hitler had decreed that Leningrad was to be destroyed rather than captured. The city would be bombarded and starved, until it ceased to exist, its population eliminated, the symbol of Soviet power and culture erased from the map. There was to be no occupation, no acceptance of surrender, just obliteration. The food situation inside Leningrad deteriorated with horrifying speed after the ring closed. The pre-war food reserves had been calculated for approximately 2 months. After the garrison and civilian population were fully counted and supplies began to be systematically cut off, the actual reserves were far smaller. By November 1941, the official civilian bread ration had fallen to 250 grams per day for workers and 125 grams per day for dependents, approximately 900 calories and 450 calories respectively, at a time when the severe cold required enormous caloric expenditure just for survival. The bread itself was adulterated, mixed with cellulose, sawdust, and other materials to increase its apparent volume. People starved in numbers that are difficult to comprehend, even as statistics. Approximately 800,000 civilians died during the siege, the vast majority from hunger and cold in the winter of 1941 to 1942. Bodies lay in the streets because the living lacked the energy to move them. Cannibalism occurred, documented in the security services reports. Children as young as 6 and 7 walked to factories to work, contributing what little they could to the city's defense production. The lifeline that sustained Leningrad through the worst of the siege was the Road of Life, Doroga Gizny, a route across the ice of Lake Ladoga that, when the ice was thick enough, allowed trucks to carry supplies into the city and evacuate the most vulnerable civilians, particularly children, outward. The trucks drove without lights to reduce the risk of Luftwaffe attack across ice that was sometimes barely strong enough to bear their weight. Hundreds of vehicles fell through the ice and sank with their drivers. The quantities that could be delivered were never sufficient, but they kept the city alive. The culture of the besieged city was maintained with a determination that becomes almost incomprehensible in retrospect. The Leningrad Philharmonic Orchestra performed Shostakovich's 7th Symphony, the Leningrad Symphony, which the composer had begun while the city was under bombardment in the besieged city in August 1942. The performers were so weakened by hunger that some had to be brought from the front lines, where they served as soldiers. The performance was broadcast over loudspeakers to the German positions, and the Germans who heard it reportedly fell silent. Stalingrad was a different kind of ordeal, not the slow suffocation of a siege, but the convulsive violence of the most brutal urban battle in the history of warfare. The German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, reached the Volga River and the outskirts of Stalingrad in late August 1942, after an offensive that had initially seemed to validate the German Mieti drive toward the oil fields of the Caucasus that Hitler hoped would simultaneously cripple the Soviet war economy and fuel the German one. The initial bombardment of Stalingrad on August 23 to 25 killed approximately 40,000 civilians and reduced much of the city to rubble. But rubble, paradoxically, aided the defense. In a city of standing buildings, a tank-supported force could advance relatively rapidly. In the ruins that the Luftwaffe created, the tactical advantage of armor was dramatically reduced, and the defenders' advantage's knowledge of terrain, ability to fortify every fragment of masonry, unlimited hiding places for snipers and anti-tank teams were maximized. The battle for Stalingrad became what the Germans called Rattenkrieg, rat war, fought not for cities or kilometers, but for single buildings, for single rooms, for single staircases. The most famous single building was the Pavlov's House, a 4-story apartment building on Solchnaya Street that a sergeant named Yakov Pavlov and a platoon of approximately 25 defenders held for 58 days against repeated German attacks, contributing to the Soviet defensive perimeter that kept the Germans from pushing the last Soviet forces into the Volga. The ruins of Stalingrad's major industrial complexes, the Barakadi gun factory, the Red October steel plant, the Dzержinski tractor factory, became the sites of week-long battles for individual workshops. General Vasily Chuikov, commanding the Soviet 62nd Army in Stalingrad, developed tactical adaptations to urban warfare that allowed his outnumbered forces to maximize the psychological and physical challenges that the ruined city posed to the Germans. Hugging tactics. Keeping Soviet forces as close as possible to the Germans, sometimes within grenade throwing distance, negated the German advantage in artillery and air support, since the risk of hitting their own troops prevented the Germans from using their heavy weapons freely. Small assault groups, armed with submachine guns, grenades, and flamethrowers, infiltrated German positions through sewers, ruins, and underground passages. The Soviet counteroffensive Operation Uranus, launched on November 19 to 20, 1942, struck not at the German Sixth Army directly, but at the much weaker Romanian and Hungarian armies holding the flanks. The planning was brilliant. The Soviet Southwest Front and Don Front broke through the Romanians north of Stalingrad, while the Stalingrad Front broke through south of the city, and by November 23, the two spearheads had linked up at Kalachondon, encircling the 6th Army and portions of the 4th Panzer Army, approximately 300,000 men, inside the Stalingrad pocket. What followed was 6 weeks of progressive disintegration. Hitler refused to authorize a breakout, insisting that T. Paulus hold Stalingrad while a relief operation was mounted. The relief attempt Operation Winter Storm, conducted by Army Group Don under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, reached to within approximately 50 kilometers of the pocket before being halted by Soviet counterattacks. Paulus was ordered to hold. He held, while his army starved. The Luftwaffe's air bridge was supposed to deliver 300 tons of supplies per day. It rarely managed 100 tons. On January 31, 1943, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler in the last hours of the battle, apparently in the expectation that no German Field Marshal would surrendered himself and his headquarters. He was the first German Field Marshal ever to be taken prisoner. The remainder of the pocket capitulated in the following days. Of the approximately 300,000 soldiers of the Sixth Army, approximately 91,000 survived to enter Soviet captivity. Only about 5,000 ever returned to Germany, the last of them released in 1955. Stalingrad was the turning point of the Eastern Front and, in many respects, of the entire war. For the first time, a major German force had been destroyed, not merely defeated, not merely driven back, but completely annihilated. The myth of German military invincibility, already damaged at Moscow, was now irrecoverably broken. A quiet Sunday morning, December 7, 1941. The Hawaiian sky was clear, the water in Pearl Harbor calm and blue, and most of the sailors were still finding their way through the routine rituals of a peaceful Sunday, writing letters, eating breakfast, going to Sunday services. It felt like any other peaceful morning on the island. Nothing suggested that the next 2 hours would transform the United States from a nation determined to stay out of the war into one committed to fighting it to total victory. Across the Pacific Ocean, approximately 275 miles north of Oahu, a Japanese strike force of 6 aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Huryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku had been maintaining radio silence for 12 days since departing the Kuriil Islands. The fleet's commander, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, had 408 aircraft at his disposal for the attack. At 6 a.m., the first wave of 183 aircraft launched from the carriers. At 7:55 a.m., they arrived over Pearl Harbor. The attack was brilliantly planned and executed. The first wave targeted the battle E-ships of Battleship Row 7, massive vessels moored in pairs, and the American airfields at Hickam, Wheeler, and UA. Torpedo planes, flying unusually low to deploy weapons in the shallow harbor waters, struck the stationary battleships with devastating effect. The USS Arizona was hit by an armor-piercing bomb that penetrated to the forward ammunition magazine. The resulting explosion killed 1,177 of her crew, more than half the total American dead from the entire attack. The ship sank in 9 minutes. The USS Oklahoma was hit by multiple torpedoes and capsized, trapping 429 men inside. The USS West Virginia, Nevada, California, and Maryland were all damaged or sunk. A second wave of 170 aircraft arrived approximately an hour later, targeting remaining ships and infrastructure. The attack lasted approximately 2 hours. When it was over, 2,403 Americans were dead, 1,178 were wounded, 8 battleships were sunk or damaged, 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers were damaged, and approximately 347 aircraft were destroyed or damaged. It was the most devastating single-day military attack on American soil in history. Yet, the attack had failed in its ultimate objective. The 3 passive I-Sea fleet aircraft carriers USS Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were not at Pearl Harbor that day. Enterprise and Lexington were at sea delivering aircraft to outlying islands. Saratoga was at Puget Sound, undergoing maintenance. These vessels, which would prove to be the most important warships of the Pacific War, survived. Admiral Nagumo chose not to launch the recommended third strike that might have destroyed the Pearl Harbor fuel storage facilities, dry docks, and submarine bases facilities, whose destruction would have severely limited the U.S. Pacific Fleet's ability to operate from Hawaii for months. The attack was destructive, but incomplete. More consequentially, the attack on Pearl Harbor unified the American people. The political divisions that had characterized American attitudes to the war, the powerful isolationist movement, the America First Committee, the general reluctance to be drawn into another foreign conflict, dissolved overnight. On December 8, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress and the nation. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately acknowledged by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Congress declared war on Japan with a single dissenting vote. Hitler and Mussolini, under the terms of the Tripartite Pact, declared war on the United States on December 11. This was one of the most consequential decisions of the entire war. Hitler was under no obligation to do so. The Tripartite Pact required mutual defense only if a member was attacked, and Japan had been the aggressor at Pearl Harbor. His decision to declare war on the United States converted a Pacific conflict, which might have consumed American military resources in the Pacific and kept America out of the European war for years, into a global war in which the full weight of American industrial power would be directed against Germany. It was, in retrospect, one of Hitler's greatest strategic blunders. The Japanese expansion that followed Pearl Harbor was breathtaking in its speed and scale. In the Philippines, Japanese forces invaded on December 8, forcing the retreat of American and Filipino forces under General Douglas MacArthur to the Bataan Peninsula. MacArthur was ordered by Roosevelt to leave the Philippines, departing by PT boat and submarine to Australia, making his famous promise, "I shall return," while the Bataan garrison, lacking food, ammunition, and any prospect of relief, surrendered in April 1942 in the largest American military capitulation since the Civil War. The Bataan Death March that followed the surrender killed approximately 10,000, took approximately 10,000 Filipino and American prisoners through a combination of deliberate brutality, starvation, disease, and the casual killing of those who fell out of line during the roughly 60-mile forced march to the prisoner assembly area at Camp O'Donnell. It was one of the most widely reported Japanese atrocities of the Pacific War and contributed significantly to the dehumanizing portrayal of Japanese soldiers that characterized much American wartime culture. Hong Kong, Guam, Wake Island, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, Burma, the Solomon Islands all fell within months to Japanese forces whose speed, tactical skill, and ruthlessness consistently overwhelmed colonial defenders who had vastly underestimated Japanese military capability. By mid-1942, Japan controlled territory stretching from the Aleutian Islands in the north to within striking distance of Australia in the south. An empire of stunning geographic scale assembled in 6 months of nearly unbroken military success. The turning point in the Pacific came at a place whose name few people had heard before June 1942, Midway, a tiny atoll in the Central Pacific, home to a small American naval station and a large number of albatrosses, but of enormous strategic significance as the westernmost American outpost in the Central Pacific. The Japanese plan at Midway was devised by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, who understood perhaps better than any other Japanese military leader that Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. His strategy was to force a decisive naval battle, a climactic engagement in the tradition of the Battle of Tsushima that would destroy the American carrier fleet before American industrial production restored the naval balance. Midway Island was the bait. Its capture would force the American Pacific Fleet to defend it. The plan might have worked if it had remained secret. It did not. The American Navy's Combat Intelligence Unit, OP-20G, working with partial breaks into the Japanese naval cipher, JN-25, determined that Midway was the target and approximately when the attack would come. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, laid a trap. 3 American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, which Japanese intelligence believed was out of action, positioned themselves northeast of Midway, outside the area of Japanese reconnaissance. On June 4, 1942, Japanese aircraft struck Midway Island. The American garrison's fighter defense was swept aside. But while Nagumo's carriers were preparing for a second strike on Midway's installations, American torpedo bombers found them. The torpedo attacks conducted at low altitude against intense anti-aircraft fire and zero fighter cover were catastrophically costly. All 15 TBD Devastators of VT-8 Torpedo Squadron from Hornet were shot down without scoring a hit. Of the 41 torpedo planes that attacked in 3 waves, only 6 returned. Not a single torpedo hit was recorded. But the torpedo attacks, suicidal as they were, had drawn the Japanese Zeros down to sea level, leaving the carriers vulnerable to the dive bombers arriving from high altitude. Lieutenant Commander Clarence McCluskey's Enterprise Dive Bow, Meteor Group, and Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's Yorktown Group found the Japanese carriers at approximately 10:20 a.m. In approximately 5 minutes of combat, American SBD, Dauntless dive bombers, put bombs through the flight decks of 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, which were loaded with aircraft armed and fueled for operations. All 3 were consumed by catastrophic fires and sank before nightfall. The 4th carrier, Haryu, was caught and sunk in a subsequent strike. Japan had lost 4 of its 6 Pearl Harbor carriers. The battle had reversed the naval balance of the Pacific in a single morning. The strategic weight of Midway cannot be overstated. Japan had lost the offensive initiative. The construction of American carrier forces would accelerate Japanese losses in trained aircrew were irreplaceable. The war that Yamamoto had feared, a long war of attrition that the United States would inevitably win, was now essentially certain. The American campaign in the Pacific following Midway was the strategy of island hopping, the systematic capture of islands that could serve as air bases for further advance, bypassing heavily fortified positions that could be isolated and left to wither without supply, and establishing stepping stones across the vast distances of the Pacific toward Japan itself. The concept was elegant in theory and murderous in practice. Guadalcanal, invaded in August 1942, was the first major offensive operation of the island-hopping campaign, and it nearly failed. For 6 months, American Marines and soldiers fought in jungle conditions of horrifying difficulty against Japanese defenders who fought with a fanaticism that American troops had not previously encountered, in diseases like malaria and dysentery that produced more casualties than enemy action, in conditions of heat, mud, and rot that degraded equipment and human health simultaneously. The naval battles around Guadalcanal were among the most intense of the entire Pacific War. American and Japanese ships fought a series of nighttime engagements in the waters known as the Slot, in which both sides suffered severe losses. The critical engagement on Guadalcanal was the battle for Henderson Field, the airstrip whose control was the strategic core of the entire campaign, in October 1942, when a Japanese force of approximately 20,000 men launched a sustained assault on the American defensive perimeter. The Marines held Japanese tactics, massive frontal infantry assaults, banzai charges, night infiltration were brave but tactically inappropriate against dug-in defenders with machine guns and artillery. The Japanese suffered approximately 3,000 killed in a single night. It was the battle that demonstrated, in the starkest possible terms, that American Marines would not break. The battles of the Central and Western Pacific that followed Guadalcanal, Tarawa, November 1943, Saipan, June to July 1944, Leyte Gulf, October 1944, Iwo Jima, February to March 1945, Okinawa, April to June 1945, each produced their own terrible statistics. Tarawa's 3 square miles of atoll cost 1,000 American dead and 2,000 wounded in 3 days. Iwo Jima's 5 square miles cost 6,800 American dead and 19,000 wounded in 5 weeks. Okinawa, the final major campaign before the projected invasion of Japan, cost approximately 12,000 American dead and 38,000 wounded, plus approximately 100,000 to 110,000 Japanese military dead and an estimated 100,000 or more Okinawan civilians killed in the crossfire. The kamikazes, the Divine Wind, Toko, suicide attack aircraft first deployed in significant numbers during the Battle of Leyte Gulf and reaching their greatest intensity at Okinawa, were perhaps the most psychologically disturbing weapon of the Pacific War. Young men, sometimes barely trained, crashed their aircraft into American ships with no intention of surviving. They were not mindless automatons. Many left behind diaries and letters that reveal thoughtful, educated young people who had made peace with their own deaths and who genuinely believed they were sacrificing themselves for something larger. But what they were sacrificing themselves for was a system of imperial mythology that had used them as instruments. At Okinawa, kamikazes sank 36 Allied vessels and damaged 368 others, killing nearly 5,000 Allied sailors, more than any other Japanese weapons system in the campaign. While the world was burning with tanks, gunfire, and the screams of battles fought across deserts, jungles, and oceans, her kind of war was happening behind closed gates, barbed wire, and locked cattle cars. It was systematic, it was bureaucratic, it was, in the chilling language of its perpetrators, a solution to a problem. The Holocaust was not a byproduct of the war, it was, in crucial respects, one of its purposes. The Holocaust did not begin with death camps or gas chambers. It began with words, with propaganda, with laws, with the progressive exclusion of Jews from German society that began in 1933 and escalated in carefully planned stages, each step normalizing conditions for the next. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 stripped German Jews of citizenship. The April 1938 decree required Jews to register their property. The November 1938 Kristallnacht pogrom announced that the state would no longer merely discriminate against Jews, but would actively encourage and organize violence against them. The forced emigration policy of 1938 and 1939, which pressured Jews to leave Germany and Austria while confiscating most of their remaining assets, expelled hundreds of thousands. Then the war began, and the possibilities that war offered for extreme action, the suspension of normal legal constraints, the cover that military operations provided for mass killings, the conquest of territories with large Jewish populations opened pathways that the Nazi leadership exploited with systematic thoroughness. The mass murder began in the Soviet Union following the launch of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. The Einsatzgruppen, 4 mobile killing units, totaling approximately 3,000 men drawn from the SS, the security police, and the order police, followed the German armies into the Soviet Union with explicit orders to kill Jews, Communist Party officials, Asiatic inferiors, and other designated enemies. Their method in the initial phase was simple and direct. They arrived in a town, gathered the Jewish population under various pretexts, a registration requirement, a work assignment, marched them to prepared killing sites outside the town, ordered them to undress, and shot them. The bodies were buried in mass graves. The Einsatzgruppen's operational reports to Berlin, meticulously preserved, record their activities with bureaucratic precision. Numbers killed, dates, locations, methods. The scale of the killing was unprecedented in its speed. At Babi Yar, a ravine outside Kiev, approximately 771 Jews were shot over 2 days, September 29th and 30th, 1941. At Rumbula, outside Riga, approximately 25,000 Jews in 2 days in November and December 1941. At Ponary, near Vilna, approximately 70,000 to 100,000 Jews over the course of the occupation. By the end of 1941, the Einsatzgruppen had killed approximately 500,000 people. By the end of the entire campaign, approximately 1.5 million. But even the Einsatzgruppen were considered insufficiently efficient. The Wannsee Conference of January 20, 1942, a meeting of 15 senior Nazi officials in a villa on the Wannsee Lake near Berlin, convened by Reinhard Heydrich and recorded by Adolf Eichmann, was not the occasion on which the decision to exterminate the Jews of Europe, was made. That decision had already been made and partially implemented. It was a coordination meeting to ensure that all relevant agencies of the German state understood their roles in implementing what the Nazis called the final solution of the Jewish question, the deportation and systematic murder of all 11 million Jews of Europe, including those in countries not yet under German control. The death camps that implemented this policy were different in kind from the concentration camps that had existed since 1933. The concentration camps Dachau, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, and others were primarily designed for detention, forced labor, and the murder of designated individuals and groups. The 6 death camps established in occupied Poland between 1941 and 1942, Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, and Auschwitz-Birkenau, were built specifically and primarily for mass killing. Chelmno, the first, began operations in December 1941. Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest, received its first Jewish transport for systematic murder in March 1942 and eventually accounted for approximately 1.1 million deaths, the largest single killing site in human history. The process at Auschwitz-Birkenau followed a pattern designed to maintain order and prevent panic. Deportees arrived by train were unloaded on the Judenramp until May 1944, then the internal Birkenau ramp, and underwent selection by SS doctors. Those selected for immediate death: elderly people, children, women with young children, the sick and infirm. Approximately 70 to 80% of most transports were told they would take showers before beginning their work or assignment, and were directed to the undressing rooms adjacent to the gas chambers. Their clothing, jewelry, and other valuables were systematically collected. The gas chamber doors were sealed and Zyklon B pellets were dropped through openings in the roof. Death came in approximately 15 to 20 minutes. The bodies were removed by Sonderkommando Jewish prisoners, forced on pain of death to perform this work: gold teeth extracted, hair shaved, and then the bodies burned in the crematoria. The deportation of Jews from throughout Nazi-controlled Europe to these camps continued until the final months of the war. The Hungarian deportations of May to July 1944, conducted by Hungarian gendarmerie with German SS supervision and resulting in the deportation of approximately 437,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz in approximately 50 days, occurred when the Red Army was already approaching from the east and Allied forces were advancing through France. The Nazi regime continued to prioritize the murder of Jews even when it was diverting resources from the military effort that was its only hope of survival. Resistance within the camps occurred against conditions of near total German sea control and was nearly always suicidal in its immediate consequences. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of April to May 1943 was the most significant act of armed Jewish resistance. When SS and police units entered the Warsaw Ghetto on April 19, 1943, to begin the final deportation of the remaining approximately 60,000 Jewish inhabitants, they were met by the Jewish Combat Organization, ZOB, and the Jewish Military Union, ZZW, armed with a small number of pistols, grenades, many homemade, and a few rifles. The uprising lasted approximately 4 weeks longer than either the Polish campaign of September 1939 or the French campaign of May to June 1940. The fighters knew they had no prospect of survival. Their goal was to choose their own manner of dying rather than to die in the gas chambers. Approximately 300 German soldiers were killed or wounded in the fighting. The ghetto was systematically destroyed building by building. Approximately 13,000 Jews died in the fighting, and the remaining survivors were deported to the Treblinka death camp. The numbers that the Holocaust produced are familiar as statistics and remain almost impossible to process as human realities. 6 million Jews murder erred approximately 1/3 of the world's Jewish population, approximately 2/3 of European Jewry. Among them, approximately 1 million children under the age of 15. The Polish Jewish community, which had numbered approximately 3.3 million before the war, was reduced to approximately 380,000. The Jewish communities of the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, were essentially completely destroyed, killed percentages exceeding 90%, and alongside the Jews, approximately 500,000 to 1.5 million Romani and Sinti people, approximately 300,000 people with physical or mental disabilities, killed in the T4 euthanasia program, approximately 1.8 million to 2 million non-Jewish Poles, approximately 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war, deliberately starved to death or killed in the first years of the war, hundreds of thousands of Soviet civilians, and tens of thousands of political opponents, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexual men, and others. The Holocaust was unique in the history of genocide, not in the scale of its victims alone, but in the systematic, bureaucratic, industrial character of the killing, the explicit ideological commitment at the highest level of the perpetrating state to the total elimination of a defined group of people, and the extensive participation of ordinary Germans and citizens of occupied countries who were not sadists or fanatics, but who chose, under varying degrees of pressure and inducement, to participate in or enable the killing. The guns were still firing in the distance. The world was caught in the chaos of war. But for millions across Europe, from Norway to Greece, from France to Poland, the war had taken on a face that was simultaneously more intimate and more pervasive than distant battles. It was the face of occupation. The foreign soldier on the street corner, the curfew that required you to be home by dark, the ration card that determined what you could eat, the knock on the door at 3 in the morning that might mean anything. German occupation policy varied significantly across the conquered territories, reflecting the Nazis' racial ideology and their assessment of the strategic importance and ethnic character of different regions. In Western Europe, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, Denmark, the occupiers generally attempted to maintain the economic functioning of the territories and limited, at least initially, the most extreme manifestations of their ideology. These populations were considered racially closer to the Germanic ideal, and their cooperation was more valuable than their subjugation. In Eastern Europe, Poland, the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, the occupation was exterminatory from the beginning. Poles were considered racially inferior, suitable only for labor slavery and ultimate displacement. Jews everywhere faced murder. Slavs in the East faced a process of systematic depopulation in service of the German colonization that was Nazism's ultimate objective. In France, the complexity of occupation was compounded by the existence of the Vichy regime, nominally sovereign, genuinely collaborative, and a source of intense moral controversy both during and after the war. Vichy France was not a German puppet in the simple sense. It had its own interests, its own ideology, conservative Catholic nationalism rather than fascism, and its own agenda. But its collaboration with the German occupiers, including the implementation of anti-Semitic laws that went beyond what the Germans had initially required, and the active participation of French police in the roundup and deportation of Jews, made it complicit in crimes that France's post-war mythology of universal resistance long concealed. The roundup of Jews in Paris on July 16 and 17, 1942, the Val d'Hiv roundup, named after the Velodrome de Hiver cycling stadium, where approximately 13,000 Jews, including 4,000 children, were held before deportation, was conducted primarily by French police, not German SS. The French government did not formally acknowledge its responsibility until 1995, when President Jacques Chirac said clearly what his predecessors had avoided saying. France on that day committed the irreparable. Breaking her word, she delivered those who were under her protection to their executioners. The experience of occupation produced the full spectrum of human moral response, from extraordinary heroism to abject collaboration with the vast middle ground of ordinary people trying to survive, protect their families, and make impossible choices under impossible conditions. The rescuers, those who hid Jewish families, forged documents, maintained escape routes, fed and sheltered the hunted, risked not only their own lives, but those of their entire families. The informers, those who trade resistors, reported hidden Jews to the authorities, identified escaped prisoners, often did so for small material rewards, for personal revenge, or simply because the system rewarded denunciation and punished non-cooperation. The Le Chambon-sur-Lignon phenomenon, the Protestant village in the massive central of France that collectively sheltered approximately 3,000 to 5,000 Jews and other refugees during the occupation, inspired by the pacifist resistance theology of their pastor André Trocmé, demonstrated that even under occupation, entire communities could choose principled resistance. Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat who arrived in Budapest in July 1944, and, through a combination of legal ingenuity, personal courage, and sheer audacity, saved tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews from deportation before his arrest by the Soviets in Tanz before Denmark, demonstrated what a single determined individual with diplomatic credentials could accomplish. The psychological reality of occupation, the sustained anxiety, the ever-present fear of arbitrary arrest, the impossibility of trusting anyone completely, the gradual deformation of daily life under constant surveillance produced with hat psychologists have described as a collective trauma that persisted long after the physical occupation ended. Countries that had been occupied found it enormously difficult to process the full complexity of their experience during the collaboration, the accommodation, the heroism, the cowardice, and national memories were often simplified into narratives of resistance that obscured the more ambiguous reality. The vast oceans of the world were no longer peaceful pathways of commerce. They had become deadly battlegrounds, where unseen enemies lurked in the cold depths, where a single torpedo could send 1,000 tons of essential supplies, food, fuel, weapons, machinery to the bottom in minutes, and where the outcome of the war could be decided not by the clash of armies or the victories of air forces, but by the simple, grinding arithmetic of ships built versus ships sunk. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous campaign of the entire Second World War, running from September 1939 to May 1945, was fundamentally a struggle for supply. Britain imported approximately 55 million tons of goods per year in peacetime and could not feed its population, fuel its war industries, or IP its forces without those imports. Germany's U-boat fleet, commanded by Admiral Karl Dönitz, with operational intelligence and strategic vision that earned him genuine respect even from his enemies, aimed to reduce those imports below the threshold that would force Britain to seek terms. The U-boat war went through several distinct phases. In the first phase, from September 1939 to June 1940, German submarines operated with limited numbers but established the basic tactical approach. Individual boats hunting independently along known shipping routes, attacking primarily at night from surface position to avoid ASD sea detection. In the second phase, from July 1940 to December 1941, Dönitz introduced Wolfpack tactics, concentrated group attacks on convoys coordinated by radio, and benefited from the acquisition of bases in France that dramatically extended operational range. The U-boats called this period the happy time, die glückliche Zeit. In 1940 and 1941, they were sinking ships faster than the Allies could build replacements. The technological and tactical battle at sea was as intense as any air campaign. The British introduction of high-frequency direction finding, HF/DF, or HF-DUF, which could locate a submarine within minutes of it, transmitting a radio message, fundamentally changed the equation. Very long-range, VLR, aircraft, initially American B-24 Liberators, modified with additional fuel tanks, began to close the black pit in the mid-Atlantic that had previously been beyond air cover, where submarines could operate without the threat of air attack. The Hedgehog forward-throwing anti-submarine mortar, the 10-centimeter radar that could detect submarine periscopes in daylight, and improved depth charge patterns all steadily increased the lethality of Allied anti-submarine forces. The breaking of the German naval Enigma cipher, specifically the capture of Enigma materials from the submarine U-110 in May 1941 by the Royal Navy, gave Bletchley Park the ability to read Dönitz's operational communications, allowing convoy routing around Wolfpack positions. The critical importance of this intelligence advantage was almost catastrophically threatened in February 1942 when Germany introduced a fourth Enigma rotor for submarine communications, creating the blackout period in which Ultra was unavailable for U-boat traffic for nearly a year. During this period, Allied shipping losses reached catastrophic levels. By May 1943, Black May, for the U-boat fleet, The combination of improved Allied anti-submarine tactics, radar, ultra, and the closure of the air gap had reversed the equation decisively. In May 1943, 41 U-boats were lost, approximately a quarter of the operational fleet. Dönitz temporarily withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic. They returned with improved equipment, but were never again able to seriously threaten the Atlantic supply route. The human cost of the Battle of the Atlantic was enormous. Approximately 3,500 Allied merchant vessels were sunk, with the loss of approximately 36,200 merchant sailors. The Royal Navy and Allied navies lost approximately 175 warships and approximately 36,000 sailors. On the German side, approximately 783 U-boats were sunk and approximately 28,000 U-boat crewmen were killed, about 70% of all personnel who served. The shock of Pearl Harbor did more than bring the United States into the war. It triggered the most rapid and comprehensive economic mobilization in the history of any nation, a transformation of American industry, society, and political economy. The doubly had produced the material conditions for Allied victory. The scale of American wartime production is almost impossible to convey in conventional terms. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced approximately 300,000 military aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 71,000 naval ships, 64,500 landing vessels, 41,000 artillery pieces, 3 million machine guns, and 12 million rifles. The Liberty ship program, which applied assembly line mass production techniques to shipbuilding, reduced the average construction time per vessel from approximately 230 days in 1941 to approximately 42 days by 1944. One ship, the Robert E. Peary, was assembled in a record 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. The Soviet Union received approximately $11.3 billion in Lend-Lease assistance from the United States, including PRE, 400,000 trucks that provided the Red Army the mobility it needed for its great offensive operations of 1943 to 1945. Women's entry into the wartime workforce transformed American society in ways whose full consequences would take decades to emerge. Approximately 6 million women entered paid employment for the first time during the war. The iconic Rosie, the riveter, the image of a woman in work clothes, flexing her arm and declaring, "We can do it," was a genuinely transformative cultural symbol, though its post-war recycling as a feminist icon somewhat distorts its original wartime context as government propaganda urging women to take factory jobs. Women worked as welders, machinists, electricians, and engineers in industries that had never previously employed them. They demonstrated capabilities that the pre-war culture had systematically denied, and the experience, however much the post-war culture attempted to push women back into domestic roles, fundamentally changed American women's relationship to paid work. The mobilization also exposed and exacerbated racial inequalities that the war's democratic rhetoric was poorly equipped to acknowledge. African American men and women served in segregated military units, the Tuskegee Airmen, the 761st Tank Battalion, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed of Japanese Americans, many of whose families were simultaneously being held in internment camps, often performing with extraordinary distinction while denied the basic equality that the war was nominally being fought to defend. The contradiction between fighting for racism abroad and maintaining Jim Crow at home was not lost on Black Americans, and the Double V campaign, victory against fascism abroad, victory against racism at home, expressed the determination to use the war's moral language to advance the cause of racial justice. The alliance between the United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain, which Churchill called the Grand Alliance, was perhaps the most improbable coalition in the history of warfare. The three countries were radically different in their political systems, their strategic cultures, their economic structures, and their visions for the post-war world. Churchill was a romantic imperialist who dreamed of preserving the British Empire. Roosevelt was an idealistic internationalist who believed in national self-determination and the creation of a post-war order of collective security. Stalin was a communist dictator who was primarily interested in Soviet security and territorial expansion. All three were capable of brilliant strategic insight, all three were capable of serious strategic error, and all three were united by nothing except their opposition to the same enemies. The central strategic debate of the Grand Alliance was the question of the Second Front. Stalin, whose country was bearing the overwhelming burden of the war against Germany, insisted from the beginning on a British and American landing in Western Europe that would draw German forces away from the Eastern Front. Churchill resisted the premature cross-channel invasion, arguing correctly that the military conditions did not yet exist for success and that a failed landing would be catastrophic. The debate produced considerable bitterness. Stalin suspected, not entirely without reason, that his allies were content to let the Soviet Union exhaust itself against Germany before intervening. The summit meetings that coordinated Allied strategy Tehran in November to December 1943, where the three leaders met for the first time, Yalta in February 1945, where the post-war settlement began to take shape, and the San Francisco Conference of April to June 1945, where the United Nations Charter was drafted, were remarkable for what they achieved. The maintenance of alliance cohesion through nearly 4 years of war, despite enormous pressures and genuine fundamental disagreements about the post-war order. They were also remarkable for what they foreshadowed. The Tehran and Yalta agreements effectively conceded Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe in exchange for Soviet participation in the Pacific War, creating the conditions for the Cold War that would begin almost as soon as the shooting stopped. The Italian campaign, which began with the invasion of Sicily in July 1943 and ended only in May 1945, was one of the most grinding and costly of the Allied campaigns in the West. The terrain of the Italian peninsula, the Apennine mountain chain running down its spine, the rivers crossing from east to west that provided natural defensive lines, the long coastal flanks that could always be threatened by amphibious operation favored the defender and made every Allied advance a deliberate, costly operation. The Gothic Line, the Gustav Line, the Winter Line's successive German defensive positions, constructed with engineering skill and defended with professional determination, extracted enormous Allied casualties for relatively modest territorial gains. The fall of Mussolini in July 1943 and the Italian armistice of September 8 were political successes that complicated, rather than simplified, the military situation. Germany immediately occupied northern and central Italy, disarmed the Italian army, and established the Italian Social Republic, the Solo Republic, as a puppet state under Mussolini, who had been rescued from captivity by an SS commando operation in September 1943. The Allies, advancing northward from their Salerno landing, found themselves fighting not against Italian forces, but against German units that gave ground grudgingly and expensively. Monte Cassino, the ancient Benedictine monastery, on its commanding hill above the Liri Valley, the principal route to Rome, became the most costly single objective of the Italian campaign. 4 battles were fought for the position between January and May 1944. The second battle, in February 1944, saw Allied air forces bomb the monastery to rubble, a decision that remains controversial, since there was no evidence of German troops inside the monastery itself, though the Germans subsequently occupied the ruins, which became a more defensible position after the bombing. The final battle, in May 1944, employed a coordinated offensive along the entire Italian front and finally cracked the German position, allowing Allied forces to advance to Rome. Rome fell on June 4, 1944, 2 days before D-Day. The liberation of the First Axis capital was a genuine triumph, marked by genuine popular celebration, but it was almost immediately overshadowed by the news from Normandy. D-Day, June 6, 1944, was the largest amphibious operation in history and one of the most complex military operations ever undertaken. Operation Overlord, planned under the overall command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, put approximately 156,000 soldiers ashore on 5 beaches of the Normandy coast on the first day, supported by approximately 5,000 ships and 13,000 aircraft. The planning that preceded the landing was extraordinary in its detail and ambition. Elaborate deception operations, Operation Bodyguard, and within it Operation Fortitude, convinced the Germans that the main landing would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. The construction of 2 artificial harbors, Mulberry harbors, to support logistical operations before major port facilities could be captured, the coordination of resistance operations throughout France to disrupt German communications and reinforce the belief that Normandy was a feint. The 5 beaches, Utah and Omaha for the Americans, Gold and Sword for the British, Juno for the Canadians, varied enormously in the resistance encountered. Utah Beach was captured with approximately 200 casualties. Omaha Beach was a catastrophe. The combination of cloud cover that caused the preliminary bombing to fall short, a deviation in the landing craft navigation that put units in the wrong places, the reinforcement of the defending German division, the 352nd Infantry, and the particular difficulty of the beach terrain, a gentle slope, rising to high bluffs, commanding the entire beach, produced approximately 2,000 American casualties on June 6 alone. The soldiers who survived the landing craft ramps and the surf had to cross hundreds of meters of open beach under fire from the bluffs above. Many died without reaching the seawall. Those who made it did so through individual acts of initiative and courage rather than organized tactical operations. The Battle of the Bulge, the Ardennes offensive of December 1944, was Hitler's last attempt to change the course of the war in the West. The plan, over which Hitler overrode his generals' objections, was to drive through the Ardennes, the scene of the great success of May 1940, to Meuse River and ultimately to Antwerp, splitting the Allied armies and forcing a negotiated peace. The attack began on December 16 with 3 German armies, approximately 410,000 men and 1,400 tanks, attacking on a front of approximately 85 miles. The initial impact was devastating. The Americans, thinly deployed in the Ardennes as a quiet sector for rest and replacement training, were caught in poor weather that grounded Allied air power and driven back in several critical sectors. The siege of Bastogne, a Belgian crossroads town that controlled 7 major roads and was therefore critical to any German advance, became the symbolic heart of the battle. The 101st Airborne Division, hastily moved up from reserve, held the town despite being completely surrounded. When German General Heinrich Freiherr von Leutwitz demanded the American surrender, Brigadier General Anthony M.C. Orliff's response, "Nuts," was brief, defiant, and perfectly calibrated to the American public's need for a symbol of defiant resistance. Patton's Third Army completed a remarkable 90-degree turn and fought northward through blizzard conditions to relieve Bastogne on December 26. When the weather cleared over, December 23 and Allied air power could operate again, the German offensive was effectively over. The road to Berlin that opened after the Battle of the Bulge was not traversed without cost. The Siegfried Line, the Rhine River, and the various natural defensive positions of Western Germany exacted a steady toll on Allied forces advancing toward the German heartland. But the fundamental strategic reality was clear. Germany was being crushed in a vise between the Anglo-American forces advancing from the west and the Soviet forces advancing from the east, and the vise was closing. The Soviet Vistula-Oder offensive of January to February 1945, which covered approximately 500 kilometers in 3 weeks, was one of the most rapid and decisive military advances of the entire war. Soviet forces under Marshals Zhukov and Konev swept across Poland and reached the Oder River, the last major water obstacle before Berlin. The Wehrmacht, stripped of reserves by the Battle of the Bulge and by Hitler's insistence on fighting everywhere simultaneously rather than permitting strategic withdrawal to defensible positions, was overwhelmed. The Berlin operation, launched on April 16, 1945, involved approximately 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, approximately 6,300 tanks, approximately 7,500 aircraft, and approximately 42,000 artillery pieces. The preliminary bombardment on the night of April 15 to 16 used more ammunition than had been expended in the entire Soviet-Finnish Winter War of 1939 to 1940. The German defenders, approximately 1 million men, including many Volkssturm, elderly men, and teenage boys, conscripted in the final months, fought with a desperation compounded of genuine patriotism, ideological fanaticism, and the entirely accurate knowledge that the Soviet army's vengeance would be merciless. Hitler remained in the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden until the end, issuing orders to phantom armies and condemning anyone who suggested reality as a traitor. He dismissed Goering for allegedly attempting to negotiate without authority, dismissed Himmler for making secret peace overtures to the West, and had his brother-in-law Fegelein shot for attempting to leave the bunker. On April 29, he dictated his final political testament, married Eva Braun, in a brief ceremony, and arranged for his dog Blondie to be poisoned. On April 30, at approximately 3:30 p.m., he shot himself in the right temple while simultaneously biting down on a cyanide capsule. Eva Braun took poison. Their bodies were burned in the Reich Chancellery Garden as Soviet artillery fire fell around the Chancellery. The formal surrender of Germany was signed at Reims on May 7 and ratified at Berlin on May 8. The date was VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. The celebrations across the Allied world were genuine and overwhelming, but they contained within them the awareness of how many had died, how much had been destroyed, and how uncertain the future remained. In Moscow, Stalin announced to the Soviet people that the Great Patriotic War had been won, and the celebrations in Red Square were among the most joyous and most emotionally complex in the city's history. The pride of people who had endured what no other nation had been asked to endure, and who had prevailed. When Allied forces began liberating the concentration camps in spring 1945, the soldiers, hardened by years of combat, were nonetheless unprepared for what they found. General Dwight Eisenhower, who visited Ohrdruf concentration camp on April 12, 1945, deliberately brought journalists and photographers to document what he had seen. "I want you to take pictures of all this," he reportedly said, "because somewhere down the road of history, some bastard will say that this never happened." Eisenhower's instinct was exactly right. The documentary record of the Holocaust, the photographs, the film footage, the testimony of survivors, the meticulous records kept by the perpetrators themselves, is extraordinary in its completeness, and it has not prevented denial. The Nuremberg International Military Tribunal that tried 24 senior Nazi officials between November 1945 and October 1946 established the legal paucity of crimes against humanity and of individual accountability for state-sponsored genocide that are still the foundation of international criminal law. 12 defendants were sentenced to death, 3 to life imprisonment, 4 to terms of 10 to 20 years, and 3 were acquitted. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima, August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki, August 9, 1945, ended the Pacific War but inaugurated the nuclear age, a transformation of humanity's day. relationship to its own destructive capacity, whose full implications the world is still working through. The Manhattan Project that produced the bombs had employed approximately 130,000 people at its peak, at a total cost of approximately $2 billion, $27 billion in 2021 dollars, across dozens of facilities in the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. The key scientific breakthrough, achieving a sustained nuclear chain reaction, had been demonstrated by Enrico Fermi's team at the University of Chicago on December 2, 1942. The first test detonation at Trinity Site in New Mexico on July 16, 1945, produced a yield equivalent to approximately 21 kilotons of TNT. The Hiroshima bomb Little Boy, a gun-type uranium device with a yield of approximately 15 kilotons, killed approximately 70,000 people immediately, and a total of approximately 90,000 to 166,000 by the end of 1945, including radiation deaths. Nagasaki Fat Man, an implosion-type plutonium device with a yield of approximately 21 kilotons, killed approximately 40,000 people immediately, and a total of approximately 60,000 to 80,000 by the end of 1945. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, following the atomic bombings and the Soviet declaration of war and invasion of Manchuria on August 8. Emperor Hirohito's radio address, the first start time the Japanese people had heard their emperor's voice, announced the end of hostilities in language that carefully avoided the word surrender. The formal surrender ceremony took place on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur presiding, surrounded by Allied officers representing every nation that had fought Japan. World War II was officially over. The Nuremberg trials of 1945 to 1946 were unprecedented in scope, ambition, and consequence. They established that individuals, not merely nations, could be held legally accountable for crimes committed in the name of the state, and that following orders was not an adequate defense for participation in genocide. They created the legal categories crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity that remain the foundation of international criminal law, and they documented, in extraordinary detail, the evidence of what the Nazi state had done, creating a record that has been essential to historical understanding and to the continuing struggle against Holocaust denial. The 4 Nuremberg trials, the main trial of the major war criminals, plus the doctor's trial, the judge's trial, the industrialist's trial, and others, revealed dimensions of the Nazi system that the public had not previously understood. The corporate complicity of companies like IG Farben and Krupp in the use of slave labor, the participation of German lawyers and judges in the systematic perversion of the law, the medical experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners by doctors who had taken an oath to do no harm. The trials were themselves, not without legal controversy, the principle of non-retroactivity, that people cannot be tried for acts that were not crimes at the time they were committed, was strained by the new categories of crime, and the Soviet judges sat at Nuremberg despite the Soviet Union's own responsibility for the Katyn massacre and its own crimes against civilian populations. But the imperfections of the proceedings do not negate their fundamental achievement. For the first time in history, the winners of a war chose to try the losers in a court of law rather than simply execute them. The United Nations, founded in San Francisco in June 1945, with 50 member states, was built on a simple but revolutionary principle: that nations could, and should, resolve our disputes through diplomacy and international law rather than through war. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the UN General Assembly in December 1948, translated the moral lessons of the Holocaust and the Second World War into a legal framework of universal human rights that has shaped international law and political discourse for 7 decades. But even before the Second World War was formally over, the seeds of the next great conflict were being planted. The disagreements at Tehran and Yalta about the post-war order of Europe's Soviet insistence on buffer states of friendly governments in Eastern Europe, American insistence on democratic elections and self-determination could not be reconciled. As Soviet forces occupied Poland, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Eastern Germany, they imposed communist governments that eliminated political opposition through arrest, murder, and intimidation. Churchill's speech at Fulton, Missouri, in March 1946, in which he described an Iron Curtain descending across Europe from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, gave political language to a division that was already a physical and political reality. The Cold War that followed was not the hot war of World War II. It was fought primarily through proxy conflicts, intelligence operations, economic competition, ideological propaganda, and the ever-present threat of nuclear war. The Berlin blockade of 1948 to 1949 and the American airlift that broke it demonstrated both Soviet willingness to use economic leverage and American determination to maintain West Berlin's freedom. The Korean War of 1950 to 1953, in which Chinese and North Korean forces fought American and UN forces to a bloody standstill, showed that the Cold War could become hot in specific theaters. The nuclear arms race that developed between the United States and the Soviet Union, with both sides eventually deploying thousands of warheads capable of destroying human civilization, many times over created a geopolitical structure of canned, mutually assured destruction that paradoxically made direct military conflict between the superpowers too dangerous to contemplate, while encouraging the development of proxy wars, covert operations, and regional conflicts around the world that collectively cost millions of lives. The cost of World War II in human terms defies adequate description. Approximately 70 to 85 million people died as a direct result of the conflict, military and civilian, from combat, bombing, famine, disease, and genocide. The Soviet Union lost approximately 27 million. China lost approximately 15 to 20 million. Poland lost approximately 6 million, approximately 17% of its pre-war population, the highest proportional loss of any country in the war. Germany lost approximately 7 to 8 million. Japan lost approximately 2.5 to 3 million. The United States, which suffered far less than any of the major belligerent nations on its home territory, lost approximately 420,000 military personnel. The physical reconstruction of Europe and Asia was itself one of the greatest achievements of the post-war decades. The Marshall Plan, announced by Secretary of State George Marshall in June 1947 and implemented from 1948, provided approximately $13 billion in economic assistance to Western European countries, enabling a recovery that defied the expectations of those who had lived through the chaos and poverty of the post-World War I period. Japan, occupied by American forces under General MacArthur's direction, was transformed through economic, and democratic reforms into a stable, prosperous democracy that became one of the economic success stories of the second half of the 20th century. The liberation and establishment of Israel in May 1948, the direct consequence of the Holocaust's demonstration that Jewish survival required a Jewish state, created one of the most lasting and complex political legacies of the war. The displacement of Palestinian Arabs in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, the Nakba, created refugee populations and political grievances that have shaped the Middle East for 7 decades and show no sign of resolution. The phrase, "never again," that became the watchword of Holocaust remembrance was both a statement of resolve and a challenge that subsequent history has repeatedly exposed as unfulfilled. Genocides in Cambodia, 1975 to 1979, Bosnia, 1992 to 1995, and Rwanda, 1994, demonstrated that the international community remained capable of allowing mass atrocities even when the evidence was clear and the means of intervention existed. The establishment of the International Criminal Court in 2002, the prosecution of war criminals from the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and the continuing development of international humanitarian law represent genuine progress in the effort to hold perpetrators of mass atrocities accountable, but they also represent the continuing distance between aspiration and achievement. The legacy of World War II is ultimately ambiguous in the way that all great historical events are ambiguous. It was the most destructive conflict in human history, killing approximately 80 million people and producing suffering of a scale and kind that cannot be adequately expressed in numbers. It was also the conflict that produced the most significant advances in international law, international cooperation, and the universal recognition of human rights in human history. It destroyed fascism and military imperialism as dominant ideologies of major powers. It accelerated the decolonization of the European empires. It demonstrated that democracy, for all its messiness and inefficiency, was capable of mobilizing the economic and human resources to defeat totalitarian systems that had seemed invincible. The men and women who fought in it on every side deserved to be understood in all their complexity. As human beings making choices under conditions of extraordinary pressure, faced with demands that most of us will never face, capable of both the heroism that saved lives and the cruelty that destroyed them. Their stories, the soldier at Omaha Beach, the resistance fighter in Warsaw, the factory worker in Detroit, the concentration camp survivor, the U-boat sailor, the kamikaze pilot are not separate from our own. They are the foundation on which the world we live in was built. Understanding how the Second World War happened, how ordinary people allowed extraordinary evil to flourish through a combination of fear, selfishness, ideological blindness, and willful ignorance, is not merely a historical exercise. It is an ongoing moral obligation. The conditions that produced fascism in the 1930s, economic insecurity, wounded national pride, the search for scapegoats, the willingness to trade freedom for the promise of security and greatness, are not unique to that decade. They recur. The question that history puts to every generation is whether it will recognize the danger before the price becomes unbearable. Never again. Not as a guarantee, but as a challenge. Not as a conclusion, but as a beginning.